Iron, that was the first taste, not the metallic tang of blood, which Harrow knew well enough from the slaughtering sheds at Dipped Ford, but the sharper, collider flavor of fear oxidizing upon the tongue. He stood upon the wet cobbles of Ratcliffe Highways, boots planted firmly against the slick gradient leading down to the Thames, watching a constable heave his breakfast in Toth gutter, where the man's shoulders hunched and spasmed with a violence that seemed to rack his entire frame, while the contents of his stomach, a mess of undigested bread and small beer, swirled into the black sludge already pooling in the channel. "Steady on, Miller," Harrow said, his voice emerging flat and stripped off the comfort he might have offered a clerk's back at the Bow Street office, for here such solace felt like a luxury the street could no longer afford. Miller wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand, leaving a smear of bile across his cheekers. He refused to look at Harrow, his eyes instead fixed upon Thea Pendor of number 29 where a single tallow candle guttered in a draught, so fierce it threatened to snuff the wick entirely before he croaked that it was inside, and God help them all. Harrow adjusted his cuffs, where the stiff linen chafed against his wrists, a sharp and grounding friction against the soft cloying air drifting from the house which smelled of copper and something sweeter, like meat left too long in the summer sun, though the December damp should have arrested such decay, and he stepped forward to navigate the uneven stones with a precision that felt absurd given the chaos awaiting him, while Annaba, a woman in a threadbare shawl, held her lantern higher. Ash approached with an arm shaking so badly, the light danced wildly across the far tilde section adair of the shop to illuminate the sign of Timothy Marr, linen draper, before plunging the lower panels into shadow. "Keep it steady, mistress," Harrow muttered, as he reached out to steady her elbow, finding her skin a-scold beneath the wool and telling her he could not see to step if she meant to blind him, to which pulled back as if his touch burned and clutched the lantern handle with both hands until her knuckles turned white, while whispering that they said the baby too. Harrow did not answer, nor did Henny to confirm it, for the silence emanating from the house was heavier than any scream could have been and pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight, as he crossed the threshold where the floorboard stuck to the soles of his boots with a thin tacky resistance that pulled with a wet schluck sounders. He lifted each foot to announce his presence in the quiet hall with a rhythm that felt grotesquely cheerful in its step and stick pattern. Yet he ignored the ergito look down immediately and kept his gaze level to take in the scene with the detached inventory of a man assessing damage to cargo rather than flesh, observing how the parlor lay to his left with two bodies sprawled across the rug, in positions suggesting a struggle that had ended abruptly and violently, while a third figure, smaller, huddled near the hearth in motionless silence. He moved past them as his professional mask slipped into place like a heavy coat, knowing there would be time for horror later in the privacy of his own room, perhaps when the gin had done its work, but now there was only the recorder and the truth, or at least the version of it, that could be captured in ink before the mob tore the neighborhood apart. So Harrow unbuttoned his greatcoat to extract his ledger from the inner pocket, where the leather cover was worn smooth at her corners and stained with the grease of 100 previous investigations before. He opened it to a fresh page of paper, crisp and pale against the gloom of the room, and produced from his waistcoat his portable inkwell, a small brass vessel capped with wax to prevent spillage, and uncorked it to release the smell of nuts and iron sulfate, which rose up sharp and chemical to cut through the stench of death with a clean and orderly scent. He dipped his quill until the nib, freshly cut, gleamed black in the lantern light, and wrote the date and hour of 6 of the clock on December the 7th, 1811. The scratch of the nib against the paper sounding loud and dry like a rasping echo into the stillness as he recorded the names of Timothy Marr, master of the house, Elizabeth Marr, his wife, and their infant son whose name remained unknown. Pausing with nib, hovering over the line to wait for the ink to flow until it pooled at the tip, in a perfect trembling sphere of obsidian, before lowered the pen to describe the position of the bodies and the angle of the limbs and theatrical stillness of the room. A drop fell, detaching from Thenib, without his command to fall short distance to the page and bloom instantly, not as a neat dot, but spreading as the fibrous of The paper drank it in to turn the black fluid into a jagged irregular stain that looked disturbingly like a bruise forming on pale skin. A sat there wet and glistening to obscure the date he had just written. And Harrow stared at it, knowing he should have reached for the blotting sand kept in his satchel or scraped the page cleaner, turned to a fresh sheet to maintain the pristine integrity of the office records according to procedure and law which demanded order imposed upon chaos one neat line at a time. Yet he did not move, while outside a shout went up from the street as the voice of a man rallied others to demand entry and demand blood. The sound muffled by the thick glass off the window and reduced to a dull roar that vibrated in the floorboard, so Harrow listened to it and looked back at the stain which had stopped spreading to settle into the paper as if it belonged there, and as if the page had been waiting for thy specific corruption all along, until Miller stood in the doorway, having finally composed himself in order to re-enter, while holding his hate in his hands and twisting the bramento a knot before looking at the bodies, and then quickly away to his eyes land on Harrow's ledger and announced that Magistrate Colquhoun was on his way, having sent a runner with orders to secure the scene, though Miller trailed off into the heavy air. "Secure the scene," Harrow repeated, the words tasting of ash and old iron, as he capped the inkwell with a thumb that refused to steady itself. Miller nodded once, a jerky motion that sent the lantern light swinging wildly across the blood-slicked floorboards, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for the magistrate's boots before retreating into the corners of the scullery, where the air hung thick with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear that had nothing to do with the dead in the parlor. Colquhoun entered not as a savior, but as a storm front, his greatcoat heavy with the damp mist of the river, his face a mask of calculated calm that did not quite reach the eyes which darted around the room to catalogue the disorder before settling on Harrow with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. "Miller, shut the door," Colquhoun said, his voice low and devoid of warmth, a command that brooked no argument and turned the constable into a creature of immediate obedience who scrambled to latch the wood against the prying ears of the street, while the magistrate stepped over a discarded shoe to stand before the clerk. He did not look at the bodies. He looked at the ledger. "The mob is gathering at the crossroads," Colquhoun stated, wiping a smear of soot from his cheek with a gloved hand that came away black, revealing the sweat that beaded on his upper lip, despite the biting chill of the December morning which seeped through the thin walls of the shop to settle in the bones of everyone present. "They want a name, Harrow, and they want it before the sun fully breaks, or they will tear this house down brick by brick and hang the first man they find from the lamp post outside, regardless of guilt or innocence or the niceties of the law, which we both know counts for little when blood is in the gutters." Harrow tightened his grip on the quill until the wood bit into his palm, the pain a sharp anchor in the swirling disorientation of the room, and he waited for the instruction he knew was coming, the one that would shift the weight of this tragedy from the shoulders of a killer to the pages of his book. "The chisel," Colquhoun said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Harrow blinked, his mind scrambling to retrieve the inventory he had just begun to compile, the image of the tool rack in the kitchen flashing briefly behind his eyes, where a space gaped empty amidst the hammers and saws, a gap that spoke of a weapon taken from within the household rather than brought by a stranger from the fog. "It is missing," Harrow said, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the cramped space. "It is not," Colquhoun corrected, stepping closer so that Harrow could smell the stale tobacco and mint on his breath, a cloying mixture that fought a losing battle against the stench of death drifting in from the parlor. "You will make no mention of the missing chisel in the public deposition," the magistrate continued, his gaze locking onto Harrow's with a force that demanded absolute submission, stripping away any pretense of collaboration and leaving only the stark hierarchy of authority and duty. "If the populace believes the weapon was a household tool, they will suspect the servants or the neighbors, and the fear will turn inward, tearing this community apart from the inside, while the true monster walks free to strike again. Whereas if they believe a stranger broke in with a weapon of his own, They will unite against an external threat, and we might just keep the peace long enough to actually find him. Harrow felt the quill tremble in his hand, the nib hovering over the fresh page where the ink stains still bloomed like a bruise, a dark testament to the corruption that had already begun to seep into the record before the first word of the lie was even written. "But it is a fact," Harrow whispered, the protest dying in his throat as soon as it formed, weak and futile against the wall of Colquhoun's resolve. "It is a detail," Colquhoun snapped, his patience fraying like an old rope under tension, his hand coming down to rest on the ledger with a thud that made Harrow flinch. "And details are the currency of chaos, Mr. Harrow, while generalities are the coin of order. So I ask you again to omit the chisel and record only that the manner of death suggests a brutal assault by an unknown intruder. For the safety of this city depends not on the precision of your pen, but on the stability of the narrative you create." The silence that filled the scullery was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled chanting of the crowd outside, a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards and up through the soles of Harrow's boots, reminding him that the law was no longer a shield, but a dam holding back a flood of violence that would drown them all if it breached. He looked at Colquhoun, really looked at him, and saw the terror hidden beneath the bluster, the sweat beading on the magistrate's brow not from heat, but from the crushing weight of a responsibility too large for any one man to bear, a burden he was now passing to the clerk with the casual ease of a man handing over a dirty rag. Harrow dipped the quill. The ink welled up, black and viscous, catching the dim light of the lantern and shimmering with an oily iridescence that seemed almost alive, waiting to be spilled onto the page to solidify a falsehood into truth. He hesitated, the nib hovering a fraction of an inch above the paper, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of fists on the front door where Miller was struggling to hold back the tide of humanity demanding justice. Then he wrote, "Assault by unknown intruder." The words flowed from the nib in a smooth, dark line, the scratch of the quill sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space, a dry, rasping noise like a rat gnawing at bone, eating away at the integrity of the record one letter at a time. He did not write about the chisel. He did not write about the gap in the kitchen rack. He wrote only what was safe, what was necessary, what would keep the mob at bay for another hour, another day, perhaps long enough for the real killer to slip away into the fog or be caught by a stroke of luck that had nothing to do with the Bow Street office. Colquhoun exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame, and he stepped back from the table, wiping his hands on his coat, as if to cleanse them of the transaction they had just completed. "Good," the magistrate said, his voice regaining some of its former steel, though it lacked the conviction of true belief. "Finish the inventory, Harrow, and then prepare the deposition for the coroner, for we have no time to lose, and the night is far from over." He turned and moved towards the door, his boots clicking sharply on the floorboards, leaving Harrow alone in the scullery with the ledger and the stain and the terrible knowledge that he had just become an accomplice to the very chaos he sought to prevent. Harrow looked down at the page, at the neat, lying lines of script that already seemed to dry into a permanent record of failure, and he felt a coldness settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the winter air. Outside, the chanting grew louder, a roar of voices demanding blood, and Harrow realized with a sinking heart that the ink on the page was no longer just a tool for recording the truth, but a shackle binding him to a lie that would soon demand more than just words to sustain it. He dipped the quill again, the black fluid clinging to the nib like a promise of further corruption, and turned the page to begin the next entry, knowing that the silence of the dead was already being drowned out by the noise of the living. The door to the scullery creaked as Miller pushed it open to let in a gust of cold air and the sound of the mob, and Harrow looked up to see the constable's pale face framed in the doorway, eyes wide with a question he was too afraid to ask. "Send the girl in," Harrow said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a mask slipping into place to hide the turmoil churning beneath. "We need her statement before the light fails completely." Miller nodded and vanished back into the gloom of the hallway, leaving Harrow alone with the ledger and the growing weight of the ink that seemed to pull at his hand, dragging him deeper into the shadows of the case with every word he wrote. The quill scratched on, a relentless gnawing sound that filled the room, marking the passage of time and the erosion of justice, one lie at a time. The air inside the scullery had turned thick, a soup of coal dust, and the sour, coppery reek of fear that no amount of scrubbing could lift from the walls. Harrow pushed the ledger shut. The leather cover groaned, a sound like a dying animal, before he snapped the brass clasp into place, sealing the lie inside with a finality that made his fingers tremble. He needed air. Not the stale, recycled breath of the house, nor the heated exhalations of Colquhoun's panic, but the raw, unfiltered chill of the river that waited just beyond the garden gate. "Keep her warm," Harrow told Miller, not waiting for an answer as he shoulder-barged past the constable and out into the yard. The cold hit him first, a physical blow that stripped the heat from his cheeks and tightened the skin around his eyes, shocking the lungs into a ragged gasp that felt cleaner than any prayer. He did not stop at the garden wall, but pressed on through the narrow alleyway that wound between the backs of the terraced houses, a sliver of darkness where the fog pooled deepest, clinging to the brickwork like wet wool. Here the sounds of the mob were muffled, reduced to a distant, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated in the soles of his boots without reaching his ears, a heartbeat belonging to a city gone mad while he walked alone in the grey. The alley opened onto the wharf, a jagged lip of stone and rotting timber that dropped sharply into the black water of the Thames. The smell arrived before the sight. Brine, yes, but underneath it lay the heavier, sweeter stench of low tide, exposing the riverbed's secrets to the freezing air, old sewage, dead rats, and the slick green slime that coated every piling and stone. Harrow gripped the lapels of his coat, pulling the wool tight against his throat, and stepped onto the muddy stairs. The tide was on the ebb, withdrawing with a slow, mechanical indifference that mocked the frantic urgency of the murder investigation upstairs. Water lapped at the lower steps, sucking at the mud with a wet, smacking sound, leaving behind a ridge of black sludge that glistened under the faint, diffused glow of the street lamps struggling against the mist. He walked down to the water's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, each step requiring a deliberate effort to lift his foot free from the sucking grip of the riverbank. Nothing moved on the water. No boats rocked in the current, no lights bobbed in the distance. The Thames was a void, a vast, breathing darkness that swallowed the opposite bank entirely, erasing Wapping and the docks as if they had never existed. It was in this silence, broken only by the gentle slap of water against wood, that he saw it. Caught on a jagged protrusion of a timber piling, perhaps 20 yards out, where the mud gave way to the deeper channel, something dark flapped against the grain. It was not a body. The shape was wrong, too compact, too bundled. Harrow squinted, shielding his eyes with a gloved hand, trying to pierce the veil of fog that obscured the details. The object shifted with the current, twisting slowly on its anchor point, revealing a flash of coarse, blue fabric that looked unmistakably like sailor's duck. He hesitated. To go out there meant wading into the freezing slurry, risking the treacherous footing of the submerged stones, and delaying the deposition that Colquhoun demanded with such desperate intensity. But the knot, even from this distance, the way the bundle was tied spoke to him. It was a hitch, tight and complex, a specific interweaving of rope that he had seen only on the colliers that docked at Shadwell, men who spent their lives hauling coal and knew that a loose line meant a lost cargo or a broken neck. This was not the work of a landsman, nor the hasty tying of a thief discarding stolen goods. This was the work of a sailor. Harrow made his decision. He rolled up his trousers to the knee, exposing pale flesh to the biting wind, and stepped into the water. The cold was instantaneous, a needle-sharp shock that shot up his leg and settled in his groin, stealing the breath from his lungs and forcing a hiss through clenched teeth. He waded forward, the mud sucking at his calves, the water rising to soak the wool of his breeches until they hung heavy and sodden against his skin. The distance felt greater than it looked, the fog distorting perception so that the piling seemed to retreat as he approached, a trick of the light that played on his fraying nerves. 10 yards. 5. The smell of the river intensified, a cloying sweetness of decay that coated the back of his throat. He reached the piling and grabbed the bundle, his fingers slipping on the wet rope before finding purchase on the rough fiber. It was heavier than it looked, waterlogged and dense, dragging at his arm as he wrenched it free from the timber. The knot held firm under his grip, a masterpiece of maritime utility that refused to yield even as he pulled it from the water's embrace. He turned back towards the stairs, the weight of the bundle pulling him off balance, forcing him to stumble through the muck with a clumsy, lurching gait that sent splashes of black water flying onto his coat. By the time he reached the solid ground of the stairs, his breath came in short, white plumes, and his legs shook from the cold that had seeped into his bones. He climbed the steps slowly, one foot after the other, the bundle clutched tight against his chest like a stolen child. On the wharf, he paused to inspect his prize. The fabric was coarse, dyed a deep indigo that had faded to grey in patches, stained with oil and coal dust. There was no name tag, no mark of ownership, but the cut of the trousers was distinct, the wide legs designed for rolling up on deck, the material thick enough to resist the bite of a hemp rope. And the knot. He ran a thumb over the intricate loops, feeling the tension in the fibers, the precise geometry of a hitch used by men who trusted their lives to rope. This was evidence, real, tangible proof that a sailor had been here, perhaps recently, perhaps discarding clothes stained with blood, or simply changing into dry garments after a swim that no honest man would take in December. It contradicted the narrative Colquhoun was already building, the story of the foreign intruder, the monstrous stranger from the East End who had descended upon the innocent family like a wolf. This was local. This was one of them. Harrow shoved the bundle into his satchel, pushing it down beneath his notebooks and inkwells until it disappeared into the darkness of the leather bag. The dampness of the cloth immediately began to seep through the leather, a cold spot forming against his hip that felt like a brand. He turned back towards the house. The fog had thickened while he was in the water, rolling in from the river in dense, grey waves that swallowed the alleyway mouth, reducing the world to a sphere of visibility no larger than a room. The lantern light from the garden was gone, erased by the mist, leaving him to navigate by memory and the faint, ghostly outline of the brickwork. He walked blindly into the grey, the sound of his own footsteps muffled by the fog, isolated in a silence that felt absolute and suffocating. The river behind him continued its slow, rhythmic rise and fall, indifferent to the bundle in his bag or the lies written in the ledger upstairs. It would wash away the footprints he had left in the mud within the hour, smoothing the bank until no trace of his passage remained. Nature did not care for justice. It did not care for truth. It only cared for the tide. Harrow reached the garden gate and fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and clumsy, the metal cold enough to burn his skin. The gate swung open with a rusty shriek that sounded too loud in the stillness, a declaration of his return that echoed off the high walls. Inside the house, the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the windows that danced like specters. He could hear the murmur of voices now, the low, agitated tone of the servant girl beginning her statement, the scratch of a fresh quill on paper waiting for him to resume his role as the scribe of falsehoods. He touched the side of his satchel, feeling the damp weight of the sailor's clothes pressing against his thigh. It was a secret now, a piece of the puzzle that did not fit the picture Colquhoun was painting, a truth that would complicate the simple story of monster and victim. If he produced it, the investigation would stall. The mob would grow restless. Colquhoun would falter. If he kept it, the lie would hold, at least for tonight. Harrow stood in the shadow of the porch, the fog swirling around his ankles, and looked up at the window where the candlelight trembled. He took a breath, the cold air biting at his lungs, and stepped towards the door, the weight of the satchel pulling him backward even as his feet moved forward. The handle of the front door was cold iron, slick with condensation. He turned it. The hinges groaned, announcing his return to the house of the dead, and he stepped inside, carrying the river's secret in his bag and the taste of salt and decay on his tongue. The command hung in the damp air, sharp as a cracked whip, before dissolving into the grey wool of the fog. Harrow did not raise his voice again. He simply stood on the pavement, the chalk already gritty between his thumb and forefinger, a silent statue waiting for the chandler to move. Mr. Gable, a man whose skin possessed the waxy translucence of his own unsold tapers, shook his head. The gesture was small, a mere twitch of a chin buried deep within a frayed cravat, yet it carried the weight of a collapsing empire. 2 shillings a night, Mr. Harrow, for beeswax alone. I cannot burn my profit to feed a ghost. It is not a ghost you feed, it is the watch. Harrow stepped closer, his boot heel clicking against a loose cobblestone that shifted under the weight of the city's anxiety. The fog pressed against his face, wet and heavy, smelling of coal smoke, and the brackish rot of the low tide exposing the mudflats beneath the wharves. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat, a taste of ash and river slime that no amount of gin could wash away. Behind Gable, the shop window remained dark, a black eye staring out onto the street where other windows blazed with the frantic, ordered glow of Colquhoun's decree. 3 days since the Marrs were butchered, and the magistrate had decided that darkness was the enemy, that a grid of artificial light could hold back the chaos that had slipped through the cracks of Wapping. Gable shuffled backward, his slippers scuffing the sawdust floor of the shop, knocking over a stack of yellowed tallow candles that rolled across the counter like fallen soldiers. The neighbors light one, that is enough. They will see the flame, they will know I am awake. They will know you are dark, Harrow corrected, his voice flat, devoid of the sympathy he might have offered a week ago. And the watch takes note of the dark. Do you wish for a constable to spend the night on your stoop, counting your breaths? I wish to eat next week. Gable's hands twisted in the apron stained with drippings, the fabric bunched in white-knuckled fists. He looked past Harrow, out into the swirling mist, where the shapes of passing patrols moved like slow, lantern-bearing sharks, their presence a comfort to some and a cage to others. The fear in the chandler's eyes was not of the killer who had smashed skulls in the house 2 streets over. It was the terror of the penny pinched, the shilling lost, the slow starvation that waited when the trade dried up. Harrow knew that fear. He felt it in the hollow of his own stomach, a gnawing emptiness that the salary from Bow Street barely filled. Light the second candle, Gable. No. The refusal was quiet, a whisper lost in the draft that whistled through the shop's ill-fitting sash, but it struck Harrow with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of the order breaking, the geometry of the magistrate's plan fracturing under the weight of simple, stubborn poverty. If one man refused, another would follow. The grid would have holes. The shadows would lengthen, and in those shadows, the killer could walk unseen, or so the logic went, a logic that felt increasingly fragile as the cold seeped through the soles of Harrow's boots. He did not argue, he did not cite the statute or the emergency powers Colquhoun had invoked with such trembling urgency. Arguments required energy, and Harrow was running on fumes, his mind cluttered with the image of the bloody hammer found in the garden, the sight of the infant's cap floating in the gutter, the way the ink in his ledger seemed to spread and bruise the page no matter how carefully he wrote. Instead, he reached into his pocket. The piece of chalk was short, worn down to a nub by the doors of 100 frightened shopkeepers in the last 4 hours. It left a dusty residue on his fingers, a white stain that looked like bone meal against his skin. Harrow raised his hand, the movement deliberate, slow, and pressed the chalk against the dark oak of the doorframe. He drew a cross. The sound was a dry scratch, like a rat's claw on wood, audible even over the distant murmur of the river. 2 lines, intersecting at the center, stark and white against the blackened timber, a mark of condemnation. A signal to the patrol that this house was deficient, that it required scrutiny, that the man inside was either a fool or a conspirator with the darkness. Gable flinched as the chalk touched the wood, his shoulders hunching as if expecting a blow. "You mark me," he whispered, the color draining from what little face was visible beneath his cap. "You mark me for the watchmen. They will break my windows. They will say I harbor the devil." "They will say you harbor the dark," Harrow said, pocketing the chalk. The dust on his fingers smeared onto his breeches as he wiped his hand, leaving a faint, ghostly trail. "And in this week, that is the same thing." He turned away before Gable could plead further, before the man's desperation could crack the thin shell of duty Harrow had constructed around himself. The street stretched out before him, a canyon of gray fog punctuated by the golden squares of compliant windows. Some flames burned steady and bright, casting clear, sharp rectangles onto the wet pavement. Others flickered violently in the drafts, their light trembling, casting long, distorted shadows that danced upon the curtains like executing specters. It was a grid of anxious eyes, blinking in the gloom, watching each other, judging the intensity of the glow, measuring safety in ounces of wax. Harrow walked on, the rhythm of his steps matching the tolling of the distant church bell, a slow, mournful sound that counted down the hours until dawn. The fog curled around his legs, dampening the wool of his coat, seeping into the marrow of his bones. He passed a woman pulling a shutter closed, her face pale and tight, and she nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden of survival. He nodded back, though his eyes remained fixed on the next door, the next window, the next potential failure in the system. The chalk mark on Gable's door burned in his mind's eye, a white scar on the face of the street. It felt petty, a bureaucratic gesture in the face of butchery, yet it was all he had. It was the only tool left to impose order on a city that had slipped its moorings and was drifting towards madness. He touched the side of his satchel, where the damp bundle of sailor's trousers pressed against his hip, a cold, wet secret that contradicted every order he was enforcing. The weight of it pulled at him, a gravitational anomaly in the straight lines of his duty. Ahead, the fog thinned slightly, revealing the silhouette of a watchman leaning against a gas lamp post that had not yet been lit, his lantern dark at his feet. The man was smoking a clay pipe, the cherry of the tobacco glowing bright orange in the gloom, a single point of defiant color in a world of gray and black. As Harrow approached, the watchman straightened, tossing the pipe into the gutter where it hissed and died in the puddle. "All lit, Mr. Harrow?" the watchman asked, his voice rough with smoke and cold. "Mostly," Harrow replied, not slowing his pace. "Keep your eyes on the crosses. The dark ones are the ones that bite." He walked past the man, into the deeper swallow of the fog, the image of the burning paper from his memory flickering again, superimposed over the real flames in the windows. The grid held for now. The lights burned, but the darkness between them was growing thicker, heavier, waiting for the first flame to sputter and die so it could rush in and claim the rest. Harrow tightened his grip on the satchel strap, the leather creaking under his fingers, and stepped towards the next house, the next judgment, the next lie he would have to tell to keep the peace. The fog closed behind him, erasing his footsteps, leaving only the white cross on the chandler's door standing stark and accusing in the gloom. The latch of the anchor and star yielded to a shove that felt less like an entry and more like a surrender. Warmth hit him first, a physical wall of roasted chicory, stale tobacco smoke, and the sour tang of unwashed wool drying too close to the fire. It was a thick, chewing air that coated the back of the throat, instantly replacing the clean, biting chill of the river fog with something heavier, more human. Harrow stumbled over the threshold, his boots tracking wet slush onto the sawdust floor, and for a heartbeat, he simply stood there, letting the heat pry the stiffness from his joints. "Shut it, man, you're letting the devil in." The voice came from the corner, rough as a file on iron. Harrow pushed the door closed, the latch clicking with a finality that seemed to echo in the sudden hush of the room. 3 men sat at a table near the hearth, their faces illuminated by the erratic dancing of the flames, while others huddled in the deeper gloom, nursing tankards that smelled of small beer and despair. No one looked directly at him. Eyes were cast down or fixed on the fire, a collective avoidance that spoke louder than any greeting. In this week, a stranger was either a murderer or a witness, and neither was welcome. Harrow moved to an empty table near the back, the wood scarred by knife points and ringed with the dark stains of 1,000 spilled drinks. He sat, keeping his hat low, and extended his hands towards the meager heat radiating from the grate. His fingers were numb, the skin pale and waxy, but he could feel the prickling return of blood, a sharp, stinging sensation that made him flex his digits against the grain of the table. "2 pence for the warmth," the landlord muttered, sliding a chipped mug across the counter without looking up. "And another penny if you mean to stay dry." Harrow dropped the coins onto the counter, the copper ringing dull against the wood. He did not drink. The liquid inside the mug was cloudy, swirling with sediment that looked too much like the river water lapping at the stairs outside. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the damp fabric of the sailor's trousers hidden within the satchel before finding the small, leather-bound notebook he kept for private use. It was not the official ledger. The ledger was for Colquhoun, for the magistrates, for the pristine, unassailable record of the law. This book was for the things that did not fit, the jagged edges of rumor that the official narrative would sand down until they were smooth and useless. He pulled a pencil from his waistcoat, the graphite worn to a blunt point, and waited. The conversation at the corner table had resumed, but the voices were lower now, strained threads of sound woven tightly against the backdrop of the crackling fire. 2 men, shipwrights by the look of their handsome knuckles swollen, nails broken, skin mapped with the blue ink of dockyard tattoos, leaned in close, their breaths mingling in the cold air between them. "Saw him myself," the smaller man whispered, his voice cracking on the vowel, "just past the turn of the tide, coming up from the stairs." "Limping?" the other asked, the word dropping like a stone. "I dragging the left leg, like the hip was seized or broken long ago." The smaller man took a gulp of his ale, wiping his mouth with the back of a hand that trembled slightly. And the neck, bare skin, though it was freezing, saw the mark clear as day when he turned to spit. "What mark?" "Anchor, black ink, old work, right on the side of the neck, just below the ear. Looked like it was bleeding fresh, or maybe just rubbed raw by a collar." Harrow's pencil moved. He did not think. The hand acted on its own, driven by a compulsion that felt separate from his mind. Left leg, dragging, anchor tattoo, neck, below ear. The graphite scratched against the paper, leaving a gray trail that seemed to vibrate under his fingertips. It was a specific detail, a tangible hook in the swirling mist of panic that had consumed the parish. A limp was her identifier, a tattoo was a brand. This was not the vague description of a shadowy monster the broadsheets were printing. This was a man. A real man with a broken hip and a sailor's pride. The scratching sound was loud in the quiet room, a rhythmic gnawing that seemed to cut through the low murmur of the other patrons. Harrow frowned, pressing harder, trying to capture the nuance of the shipwright's accent, the certainty in his voice. "Certainty," he wrote, "witness claims visual confirmation." The shadow fell over the table before he heard the footsteps. It was a sudden extinguishing of the firelight, a cold draft that had nothing to do with the door. Harrow stopped writing, the pencil hovering inches above the page, the tip trembling slightly. He looked up. A man stood beside him, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy greatcoat that smelled of salt and tar. The brim of his hat was pulled low, obscuring everything but a jaw clenched tight and a mouth that looked as if it had not smiled in a decade. He did not sit. He did not ask for permission. He simply leaned forward, one gloved hand resting on the edge of Harrow's table, the leather creaking softly. "Writing down truths, Clark." The voice was low, devoid of inflection, yet it carried a weight that made the air in Harrow's lungs feel thin. It was not a question born of curiosity. It was an accusation wrapped in silk. Harrow's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, bird-like panic that threatened to choke him. He looked at the notebook, at the damning scrawl of anchor and limp, the evidence that could lead a patrol to a specific door, a specific man, a specific end. Then he looked up at the stranger, whose eyes remained hidden in the darkness of the hat's shadow. "I am warming my hands," Harrow said, his voice sounding brittle, too loud in the sudden silence of the room. The shipwrights at the corner had stopped talking. The landlord had frozen behind the bar. Every ear in the Anchor and Star was tuned to the frequency of this single, dangerous exchange. "Warming hands doesn't require a pencil," the stranger said. He shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under the movement. "And it certainly doesn't require recording the whispers of drunkards who see ghosts in every shadow. Are you writing down what happened, Mr. Harrow, or are you writing down what they want to hear?" Harrow's hand moved instinctively, sliding over the open page of the notebook, covering the words anchor and limp with his palm. The graphite smeared under the heat of his skin, blurring the letters into a grey smudge, a little bruise on the paper. "I write what I observe," Harrow said, forcing himself to meet the shadow where the man's eyes should be. "It is my duty." "Duty," the stranger spat the word, a small, dismissive sound, for enwrapping duty is a flexible thing that bends to the wind and breaks under pressure. He leaned closer, the smell of stale tobacco and old blood rising from his coat. "Be careful what you commit to paper, Clark, since ink has a memory that remembers lies longer than it remembers truth." The man straightened up, the movement fluid and predatory, and stepped back into the gloom of the room. He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked towards the door, the heavy tread of his boots sounding like a countdown. The latch lifted, the cold fog rushed in to fill the vacuum he left behind, and then the door slammed shut, leaving the room in a silence that felt brittle, ready to shatter. Harrow sat frozen, his hand still pressed flat against the notebook. The graphite smudge under his palm felt hot, burning against his skin. He slowly lifted his hand, revealing the blurred words beneath. Anchor, limp. They were still there, but they looked different now, less like facts and more like a sentence passed on a man who might already be dead. The landlord cleared his throat, a nervous, rattling sound. "More ale, sir, to take the chill off." Harrow shook his head, unable to speak. He snapped the notebook shut, the leather cover making a sharp crack like a bone breaking, and shoved it deep into his pocket. The warmth of the fire no longer reached him. The cold had seeped in through the door, through the stranger's words, settling deep in his marrow. He stood up, his legs feeling unsteady, and moved towards the exit, needing to escape the eyes of the room, the judgment of the silence, the weight of the lie he had just begun to write. Outside, the fog waited, thick and yellow, swallowing the street whole. Harrow stepped into it, the image of the blurred ink burning in his mind, a stain that no amount of washing would ever remove. He began to walk, faster now, towards the Bow Street office, towards Colquhoun, towards the fire that would consume the truth before it could ever see the light of day. The latch of the magistrate's antechamber lifted with a click that sounded too loud in the empty hallway, a sharp metallic bite against the muffled roar of the street outside. Harrow stepped across the threshold, and the warmth hit him first, a physical wall of heat that smelled of coal smoke, dried ink, and the sour tang of unwashed wool. He wiped his boots on the mat, scraping away the yellow mud of the highways, but the fog seemed to cling to his greatcoat regardless, dampening the shoulders, settling in the folds like a second skin. Colquhoun stood by the hearth, back turned, staring into the grate where logs burned with a fierce, consuming intensity. The magistrate did not turn immediately. He continued to pace, moving along the same worn track in the carpetty a groove dug by the heels of boots that paced out the geometry of panic until the wooler had frayed down to the stitching beneath. Left foot, pivot. Left foot, right foot, pivoter. The rhythm was mechanical, a metronome counting down the hours until the next body surfaced on the tidal mud. Harrow waited near the door, his hand still resting on the knob, feeling the cold iron seep into his palm while the fire crackled and spat embers onto the hearthstone. "Have you it?" Colquhoun spoke without turning, his voice flat, stripped of the ornamental polish he usually reserved for parliamentary committees. Harrow reached into his pocket. The notebook felt heavy, a brick of lead wrapped in leather, and for a second his fingers refused to close around the private scrap of paper tucked inside the cover. He could feel the graphite smudge on his thumb from the coffee house, a grey stain that no amount of rubbing would remove, marking him as a conspirator before he had even spoken. He pulled the scrap free, the paper thin and ragged where it had been torn from the edge of a ledger. "I heard a description, sir. Give it here." Colquhoun snapped around, extending a hand that trembled slightly at the wrist. Harrow stepped forward, the distance between them bridged in 3 strides, and placed the paper into the magistrate's palm. Colquhoun did not read it immediately. He held it over the firelight, squinting as if the script were written in a cipher only he could decode, while the flames licked at the air beneath his fingers. "A sailor," Colquhoun said, describing a man who was limping with an anchor tattooed on his neck. "It matches the witness account from the chandler's shop. It matches nothing we can use." Colquhoun crumpled the paper. The sound was dry, brittle, like a bone snapping under a heavy boot. He tossed the ball into the fire. Harrow watched. The paper landed on the coals and caught instantly, the edges curling inward as the heat grabbed hold, turning the white surface black, then grey, then nothing. The ink did not vanish, it bloomed. For a second, the words anchor and limp spread outwards, bleeding into the fibers like a bruise widening on skin, before the flames consumed them entirely, lifting the information up the chimney in a spiral of grey ash. "You do not understand the machinery, Harrow." Colquhoun turned away from the fire, walking back to his desk, where piles of depositions stood like fortifications against the dark. "The public does not want a sailor with a limp. They want a monster. They want a demon who walks out of the fog and slaughters families for the sake of evil itself." "But if we have a namer?" "A name limits us." Colquhoun slammed his hand on the desk, sending a stack of papers sliding onto the floor. "A specific man requires specific evidence. Evidence takes time. Time is a luxury the parish does not possess when mobs are sharpening knives on the wharves." He leaned forward, resting his weight on his knuckles, his face illuminated from below by the candle on the desk, casting hollows under his eyes that made him look like a skull wrapped in parchment. "We need a suspect who can absorb the rage. A vessel. If we pin this on a man with a limp and then find he was in Dipped Ford at the time of the murder, the mob will turn on us. They will burn this office to the ground." Harrow looked at the fireplace. The paper was gone. Only a faint wisp of smoke trailed upward, smelling of burnt linen and secrets. "So we ignore the truth. We manage the narrative." As Colquhoun straightened his waistcoat, smoothing the fabric over his stomach with hands that had finally stopped shaking, he declared that justice is not a pure substance, Mr. Harrow, but an alloy mixed with fear, expediency, and the need to keep the streets quiet enough for commerce to resume. He picked up a quill, dipped it into the inkwell, and tapped the nib against the rim. A single black drop fell onto the blotter, spreading into a perfect, void-like circle. "Find me a suspect who fits the shape of the fear, not the shape of the facts." Harrow stood silent. The ink on his thumb felt hot again, pulsing with a heat that had no physical source. He looked at his hand, at the stain that marked him as the man who wrote the lies, the man who recorded the fiction that would become the official history. The office felt smaller than it had an hour ago, the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing down on the top of his head. The air was thick, difficult to draw into the lungs, as if the oxygen had been burned away by the fire. "What of the sailor?" Harrow asked, his voice low, barely audible over the settling of the coals. Colquhoun kept his eyes fixed on the deposition he was signing. "The tide will take him, it always does." Harrow turned. He walked to the door, his boots making no sound on the carpet, and lifted the latch. The cold air from the hallway rushed in to meet the heat, creating a draft that made the candle flame on the desk flicker violently, throwing Colquhoun's shadow against the wall where it loomed large and distorted, a giant manipulating the tiny figures of the city below. "Lock the door behind you," Colquhoun said. Harrow stepped out into the corridor. The darkness there was absolute, unbroken by the lamplight from the office, and he had to feel his way along the wall with his fingertips to find the street exit. The ink stain on his thumb rubbed against the rough plaster, leaving a faint grey smear on the whitewash, a mark of his passage, a signature on the wall of the tomb. He pushed open the outer door, and the fog swallowed him whole, damp and cold, and indifferent to the truth he had just watched burn. He walked away from Bow Street, not towards his lodgings immediately, but aimlessly into the maze of lanes, carrying the weight of the unwritten lie in his pocket like a stone. The city waited for him to write it down. Wood splintered. A fist hammered the latch until the timber groaned, shaking the dust from the lathes above his bed. Harrow woke. He did not know the hour, only that the dark inside the room felt heavy, pressed against his eyes like a wet wool blanket, and the noise outside was not the usual cartwheels or drunkard singing, but something urgent, a something that smelled of panic even through the closed door. He swung his legs out. Cold floor. Open up, Mr. Harrow, for God's sake open up. The voice belonged to Constable Millery, a man whose lungs were usually reserved for bawdy songs in the alehouse, are now stripped bare by terror. Harrow fumbled for his breechesser. His fingers slipped on the bone button, a useless things that mocked him in the darky, while Miller continued to batter the dory at each impact, sending a vibration through the frame that rattled the single chipped plate on the washstand. It's happened again. Miller's voice dropped, a harsh whisper through the keyhole that carried more weight than a shout. Williamson's, the King's answer same as the Marrs. Harrow stopped breathing. He shoved his arms into his coat sleeves, the wool ruff against his skinny, and twisted the latchy, letting the night rush in to meet him. The street outside was a tunnel of yellow soup. Harrow ran. Miller kept pace, his breath hitching in shorty, wet gasps that sounded like a bellows struggling to catch fire. They turned onto Ratcliffe Highway, where the cobbles gleamed slick, with the damp exhalation of the rivery, and Harrow's boots skidded on a patch of slimy, sending him stumbling into the wall of a chandler's shop. Pain flared in his knee, sharp and brighty, but he pushed off the brickwork and kept moving. There was no time for blood from a graze. The fog tasted of sulphur and coal dusty, coating the back of his throat with a grit that made him want to coffee, yet he swallowed it down. Ahidi, the darkness pulsed, not with lighty, but with sound. A keening wail cut through the misty, a woman's voice, or perhaps a mancy, stripped of all humanity by grief. It pulled them forward. The crowd gathered near the pub was not a collection of individuals, but a single organism, a heaving and pressing against the doorframe, their bodies radiating a heat that fought the cold air. A Harrow shoved against a shouldery, then an elbowy, feeling the resistance of wool and flesh until he breached the perimeter. Make way, Bow Street, Miller roared, shoving a fishmonger aside with a heavy forearm. The man grunted, but did not move, his eyes fixed on the window where a candle flickered behind smudged glass. Harrow squeezed past his coat, catching on a nail protruding from the Georgian, tearing a strip of fabric that hung loose like a ragged flag. Inside the shop, the air changed. It grew heavy. The smell hit him first, iron-rich and warmy, distinct from the cold fog outside. He saw the bodies. They lay in positions too natural to be asleep, too broken to be living. A mallet rested on the counter umlaut, its handle stained dark. Look at the angle, Miller whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the eldest boy. Just like the Marr boy, head crushed, same tool. Harrow stepped closer. His boots sank slightly into the sawdust on the floor, now dark and clotted with fluid. He looked at the father, slumped over the tilly, then the mother, dragged across the room as if she had tried to crawl away. The violence was not just done, it was performed. A script written in blood and bony, repeated with terrifying precision. Harrow's hand went instinctively to his pocket, where his notebook lay waiting, a blank mouth ready to swallow the horror. He did not draw it yet. To write it down would make it really, would fix the symmetry of the slaughter into the official record where it could never be erased. Colquhoun knows, Harrow asked. Sent a runner. He'll be here within the hour, Miller said, turning away because he was unable to look at the mother's face. What do we tell them outside? They're asking for a name, saying it's a gang or a French plot, anything but a single man. Harrow looked at the mallet. It sat there, innocent wood and irony, yet it carried the weight of an entire city's fear. He thought of the letter burning in the office fireplace 12 days prior, the sailor with the limp reduced to ash because he did not fit the shape of the fear. Now the fear had grown teeth. It had come back to finish the job. Tell them nothing, Harrow said, his voice sounding flat and deadened by the thick air. Let them wait. But they'll break the windows. They're already throwing stones. Then break them. Harrow knelt beside the counter-umlaut, ignoring the wetness soaking into his trousers. He reached out but did not touch the mallet. To touch it was to claim it, to bring it into the chain of evidence that would lead inevitably to gallows. He hovered his hand over the woody, feeling the residual warmth of the grip. Someone had held this recently. Someone had walked out of here and vanished into the yellow soup of the highway, leaving the tool behind like a signature. Same handle, Miller said, his voice cracking as he recalled the other one at the Marrs, noting the same wear on the grip and the same stain. Harrow withdrew his hand. He stood his knee protesting the movement, and looked around the room. The shadows stretched long from the single candle, distorting the faces of the dead into masks of Sapricia. This was not a crime scene. It was a stage. The killer had set the lights, arranged the props, and exited before the audience arrived. Now the audience wanted blood. Harrow thought of Colquhoun's words about managing the narrative, about finding a suspect who fit the shape of the fear. The shape was already formed. It was waiting for a name to fill it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the notebook. The paper felt coldy as slick with the dampness of the night. He opened it to a fresh pagina. The inkwell in his pocket had leaked slightly, a small black bruise spreading across the corner of the cover. Give me the light, Harrow said. Miller handed him the lantern. The flame danced, casting wild shapes against the wall behind the counter. Harrow dipped his pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a sound like a rat gnawing at Bonnier. He wrote the date. He wrote the location. He paused. The ink gathered at the tip of the nibby, threatening to drop. He looked at the mallet. He looked at the door where the mob pounded her. If he wrote the truthy, or it would be too complex for them to accept. If he wrote a lee, or it might save them, the ink dropped. A single black tear bloomed on the page, spoiling the line before he had even begun. Start the record, Miller urged, glancing nervously at the window, where a stone crashed through the glassy, ascending shards skittering across the floorboards. Harrow did not look up, watching instead as the ink spread, irreversible and deep. The hook was set. The fish would bite, leaving him only to decide which one to throw to the crowd. The blot spread. It swallowed the date, the location, the very concept of Tuesday, turning the top of the page into a dark, weeping wound that mirrored the carnage at his feet. Harrow watched the ink seep into the fibers, expanding with a slow, vegetative hunger that felt obscenely alive in the freezing room. He should have turned the page, started again, preserved the sanctity of the record. Instead, he dipped the nib once more, the metal scraping against the glass well with a sharp, grating shriek that made Miller flinch. Write it, Miller said, before the candle gutters. Harrow wrote. The words did not come from thought. They arrived preformed, sliding from his wrist to the paper as if guided by a hand that had practiced this specific description a fortnight prior. Blunt force trauma, mallet, wooden handle, blood copious. The phrases tasted of ash in his mouth, stale and recycled, yet they fit the scene with a terrifying, seamless precision. He described the angle of the boy's skull, the fracture line running from temple to ear, and felt a hollow ache bloom in his own jaw, a sympathetic phantom pain triggered by the mere act of transcription. It was not observation, it was recitation. The grip, Miller prompted, leaning over Harrow's shoulder, his breath hot and sour against the clerk's neck. Did you note the wear, the thumb groove? Harrow paused, the nib hovered, a black drop gathering at its tip, trembling like a tear refusing to fall. He looked at the mallet lying on the counter. The wood was dark, saturated with fluid that had long since ceased to flow, yet it seemed to pulse under the flickering lamplight. He remembered the Marr weapon, or rather, he remembered the drawing of it, the sketch he had rendered 12 days ago in the quiet safety of the office. Was the thumb groove on the left or the right? The memory was a fog within the fog, indistinct and malleable. Left side, Harrow murmured, deep indentation, consistent with a heavy, downward swing from a right-handed assailant. He wrote it down. The lie, if it was one, dried instantly, binding itself to the page with the same authority as truth. Once ink touched paper, it became fact. It became law. The nuance of doubt, the hesitation of the human eye, the possibility of error, all was scrubbed away by the absolute black of the record. He felt a sudden, violent urge to vomit, a physical rejection of the words pooling in his stomach, but he swallowed it down, forcing his hand to move across the line. "Good," a voice said from the shadows behind them. Harrow did not need to turn. He knew the cadence of those footsteps, the specific weight of them that seemed to compress the floorboards rather than simply rest upon them. Magistrate Patrick Colquhoun stepped into the circle of light cast by the lantern. He wore his greatcoat buttoned to the throat, the collar turned up against the damp, but his face was dry, composed, terrifyingly untouched by the horror surrounding him. He did not look at the mother, whose nightdress was stiff with dried gore. He did not look at the father, slumped in a posture of eternal defeat. His eyes fixed immediately on the ledger, on Harrow's hand, on the fresh lines of text drying in the cold air. "Read it back," Colquhoun ordered. His voice was low, devoid of tremor, a sound that belonged to a courtroom rather than a slaughterhouse. Harrow cleared his throat. The taste of bile lingered, acidic and sharp. Weapon identified as a carpenter's mallet, iron-headed wooden shaft. Distinctive wear pattern on the left flank of the handle, indicating repeated use by a single individual. Method of delivery, identical to that employed in the assault upon the Marr household, Ratcliffe Highway, December 7th. Colquhoun nodded, a single sharp dip of the chin, identical. "It is the same tool, sir," Miller added, eager to please, eager to anchor the chaos to something solid. "I saw it myself. The stain on the wood matches the blood type of the first family, or so it appears to the naked eye." "Appearances are the foundation of order, Constable," Colquhoun said. He moved closer, extending a gloved finger to trace the line Harrow had just written. He did not touch the paper, but the leather of his glove hovered millimeters above the ink, as if testing the heat of the fresh words. "The public does not require complexity. They do not require the statistical probability of two distinct killers utilizing similar instruments within a 12-day radius. They require a narrative. They require a thread they can follow from the beginning of the horror to its end." Harrow looked up. The magistrate's face was pale, the skin pulled tight over the bone, but his eyes burned with a feverish intensity that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with survival. The survival of the office. The survival of the idea that London could be policed, that chaos could be pennied in by statutes and ledgers. "And if there is no thread?" Harrow asked. The question slipped out before he could cage it, dangerous and naked in the heavy air. "If the symmetry is coincidence, if the mallet is common stock, sold by a dozen chandlers from Wapping to Shadwell." Colquhoun's gaze snapped to him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. "Then we manufacture the thread, Mr. Harrow. We weave it from the evidence we have, and we tighten the knot until it holds." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Do you understand what is at stake? Not just for these poor souls, God rest them, but for the force, for the very notion that we can impose will upon this city. If we admit that the killer is a ghost, that the violence is random and unconnected, then we admit that we are powerless, and I will not have Bow Street rendered powerless by the whims of chance." Harrow felt the quill heavy in his hand, a leaden weight dragging his wrist down towards the page. He looked at the ink stain again, the black bruise spreading on the corner of the ledger. It looked like a shadow cast by nothing. It looked like the shape of a man who did not exist yet, waiting to be filled in by the pressure of the magistrate's demand. "Continue," Colquhoun commanded, demanding they detail the similarities and emphasize the precision to make it clear that this is the work of a single, calculated mind. It was a monster, not a mob. While a mob cannot be hunted, a monster can. Harrow dipped the pen. The ink was thick, sluggish in the cold, clinging to the nib like tar. He wanted to stop. He wanted to slam the book shut, to throw the lantern into the sawdust and let the fire consume the lies before they could harden into truth. But the image of the mob outside, the faces pressed against the glass, the stones waiting in the pockets of men driven mad by fear, held him in his chair. If he stopped, the narrative would fracture. The mob would rush in. They would tear the shop apart, maybe tear him apart, looking for a target that Colquhoun refused to provide. He wrote, "Assailant displays knowledge of domestic layout, strikes with efficiency, no hesitation." The words piled up, brick upon brick, building a wall between the reality of the room and the story the city needed to survive. Each sentence was a nail in a coffin that had not yet found its occupant. He could feel the ghost of the suspect forming in the white space of the page, a silhouette constructed of adjectives and circumstantial evidence, waiting for a name to be pinned to its chest. "The handle," Colquhoun said, watching the pen move. "Ensure you note the specific grain of the wood. Ash, is it not? Distinctive ash." "I cannot be certain of the species, sir," Harrow said, his voice tight, for the light was poor and a microscope remained essential. "Not in this light, not without a microscope." "Then record it as ash," Colquhoun replied, his tone leaving no room for debate, for it was ash at the Marrs and it is ash now. "Consistency is the bedrock of credibility, Timothy. Do not undermine us with uncertainty." Harrow's hand cramped, the muscles in his forearm seized, a sharp knot of pain radiating up to his elbow, but he forced the quill to scratch on. "Wood grain consistent with common ash." He wrote the lie. He signed it with his initials, a small, cramped scrawl that looked like a wound of its own. The ink seemed to smoke as it hit the page, reacting with the paper in a chemical marriage that could not be undone. Outside, the shouting grew louder. A new rhythm had emerged in the clamor, a chanting cadence that thrummed against the windowpanes, shaking the frames in their fittings. "Blood for blood, name the beast." The glass vibrated, a high-pitched humming that resonated in Harrow's teeth, syncing with the frantic scratching of his pen. He was no longer recording a crime. He was drafting an indictment for a man who might not even exist, crafting the noose that would eventually tighten around some unfortunate soul's neck. "Faster," Colquhoun urged, pacing now, his boots clicking on the floorboards. "The runner says the magistrates from Shoreditch are arriving. They will want to see the link. They will want to see that we have the situation in hand." "The situation is a butcher's shop," Harrow muttered, mostly to himself. "We have corpses, we have a tool, we have nothing else." "We have the story," Colquhoun corrected, "and the story is enough." He stopped pacing and stood directly behind Harrow, looking down at the ledger. "When you finish the description, turn the page, leave a fresh sheet. We will need space for the suspect's details once the net is cast." Harrow froze. The nib rested on the paper, a tiny black dot forming beneath it, growing larger by the second. He knew what came next. He knew the empty space Colquhoun demanded would not remain blank for long. The pressure of the city, the weight of the magistrate's ambition, the screaming of the mob, it all funneled down to this single sheet of paper, demanding a name to fill the void. "Who?" Harrow asked without looking up, for he could not bear to see the answer in Colquhoun's eyes. "Who goes in the space, sir?" "Whoever fits," Colquhoun said. His voice was devoid of malice, which made it infinitely worse. It was the voice of a man moving chess pieces, concerned only with the geometry of the board, not the lives of the pieces. "Whoever the tide washes up." "Right, Harrow, finish the record." Harrow pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed, black and endless, filling the line, connecting the dead family to the next victim, binding them together in a chain of logic that felt flimsy as spider silk yet strong as iron. He wrote until his hand numb, until the words blurred into a single dark mass, and still the magistrate stood over him, waiting for the trap to be set, waiting for the ink to dry so they could spring it on the first unlucky soul who walked into the light. The window rattled again, a violent shudder that sent a fine dusting of glass shards onto the ledger, glittering like diamonds on the black text, but Harrow did not brush them away. He just kept writing, burying the truth under layers of official fiction, one word at a time. Harrow set the quill down. The nib left a stray droplet on the margin, a black tear swelling beside the date. He could not write through the trembling of the pain. The vibration traveled through the sill, up the wrist, settling in the shoulder like a damp ache. He stood. The chair scraped against the floorboards, a harsh shriek that cut through the low murmur of Colquhoun's pacing. "Let me see them," Harrow said. Colquhoun did not turn from the corpses. "See who?" "The ones outside, the ones screaming for us." "There is nothing to see but fury, Timothy. It is all the same face when the blood is up." Harrow moved to the window regardless. The glass was cold enough to burn his palms. He leaned in, wiping a circle through the condensation with his sleeve. The wool caught on the rough putty, smearing the grime rather than clearing it. Below, the street was a churning pit of shadows and torchlight. Faces surged upward, pressed against the lower panes, distorted by the curvature of the glass and the breath fogging the exterior. Mouths opened in silent roars. Eyes caught the flare of the lanterns, reflecting back like animals caught in a trap. One man stepped forward, separate from the crush. He wore a tar-stained jacket and a hat pulled low against the drizzle. He raised an arm, finger rigid, pointing directly at Harrow's position. The shout's copyrighty acute the wood and glass, muffled but distinct. Murderers, the word landed heavy, hiding behind the glass, give us the name. Harrow flinched. He dropped the curtain. The heavy wool fell into place, severing the connection, plunging the corner of the room into deeper shadow. The light from the lanterns outside glowed through the fabric, pulsing like a diseased heart, but the faces were gone. Only the impression of them remained, burned into the retina. "We should speak to them," Harrow said, turning back to the magistrate. His voice sounded thin in the room, swallowed by the smell of blood and wet wool. "Issue a statement. Tell them we are pursuing leads. Give them something to hold onto besides rage." Colquhoun wiped his hands on a handkerchief. The white linen came away grey. He tucked it into his coat with deliberate slowness. "And what would we tell them exactly? That we have a weapon but no hand to hold it, or that we have death but no murderer?" Colquhoun walked to the table, resting his weight on his knuckles. He looked at the ledger, then at Harrow. "Fear is a utility, Harrow, like the tide, like the ink. You do not placate it, you harness it. They will tear the place down." "Let them try," Colquhoun straightened. "The runners are positioned at the alley, the constables are at the rear. They will not breach this room, but their anxiety serves a purpose. A frightened city is a compliant city. They will accept any measure we propose, any restriction on their movement, any curfew, if they believe the wolf is at the door." "There is no wolf," Harrow said, the words slipping out before he could catch them. "There is only a man with a mallet, and us." Colquhoun's eyes narrowed, while the air between them tightened, stretched thin as a wire. "There is whatever we say there is. Now finish the entry, then secure the premises." "Secure." "Bar the doors," Colquhoun said. "Every entrance. The front, the side, the cellar access. We are not leaving until the record is complete. Let them rage against the wood. It will tire them out." Harrow looked at the ledger. The page was full of lies, neat rows of fiction masquerading as fact. The ink was still wet, glistening under the candlelight. He closed the book. The sound was final, a heavy thud that echoed the slamming of a coffin lid. He walked to the door, fetching the iron bar from its bracket beside the frame. The metal was cold, slick, with condensation from the breath of the room. He fitted the bar into the brackets. It required both hands to lift, the weight dragging at his shoulders. He slid it into place. The mechanism clicked, a solid, mechanical engagement that sealed them in. He moved to the side door, repeating the process. Each bar he set was an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that they were not protectors here, but prisoners of their own making. Outside, the chanting shifted. The rhythm broke, replaced by a scattering of impacts, thuds against the wood. A stone struck the front door, hollow and dull. "They know we are locking them out," Harrow said. He stood with his hand on the second bar. "They know we are securing the evidence," Colquhoun corrected. He had returned to the table, lighting a fresh candle from the dying flame of the first. The new light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched towards the bodies on the floor. "Let them think what they wish. By morning, we will have a name for them. By morning, the wolf will be caught. And if we do not find one—" Colquhoun looked up, the flame reflected in his eyes, small and hard. "Then we shall find one who fits. The city requires a conclusion, Timothy. It cannot sustain this level of tension indefinitely. Something must break. Better the suspect than the order." Harrow stepped back from the door. The room was sealed. The air grew stagnant immediately, thick with the scent of tallow and the copper tang of the dead. He returned to the table. The ledger sat waiting. The page Colquhoun had ordered, left blank, stared up at him, a white void demanding to be filled. He picked up the quill, the feather brittle and ready to snap. After he dipped it into the inkwell, the black fluid swallowed the nib. He hovered over the paper while the silence inside the room grew worse than the noise outside. Inside, there was no excuse of chaos, only choice. A crash from the front of the shop made them both jump. Not a stone this time, something heavier, wood splintered. A shriek of tearing timber cut through the bar's protection. Colquhoun kept his eyes fixed on the ledger. "Continue," he said. Harrow pressed the nib to the page. The ink bloomed, spreading into the fibers. He wrote the heading, "Primary Suspect." He left the line below empty. The ink pooled there, a dark lake waiting for a name to drown in. The front door shuddered again, the bar groaning under the weight of the mob's desperation. Dust fell from the ceiling, settling on the open book like snow. Harrow kept writing, marking the time and the date while he wrote everything except the truth. The bar held for now, yet the wood around it was beginning to splinter as thin cracks appeared in the frame like spiderwebs. They spread outward from the pressure, waiting for the final blow that would let the night rush in. The bell above the door did not tinkle, it coughed, a rusted iron gag that choked on its own spring. Harrow stepped inside, and the air changed instantly. It was no longer the damp, cold-choked grey of the Wapping Street, but a stale, metallic soup that coated the back of the throat. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light cutting through the gloom, swirling around suspended chains and hanging rows of coats that smelled of wet wool and forgotten sweat. Behind the counter, a man sat hunched over a ledger, his face illuminated by the guttering flame of a tallow candle that cast long, twitching shadows against shelves piled high with silverware, tools, and watches stripped from wrists that would never tell time again. "You're late," the pawnbroker said. He kept his gaze fixed on the ledger, scratching a nib against paper with a sound like a rat gnawing at bone. "The constables said noon. The sun has passed the masthead." "The streets are choked," Harrow replied, shaking the damp from his greatcoat. Water dripped onto the floorboards, darkening the wood. A cart overturned near the Hermitage stairs. The crowd took the opportunity to riot. Always an excuse. The man finally lifted his head. His eyes were small, watery, and fixed on Harrow's pocket with a greed that made the clerk's skin prickle. "Mr. Sealer's Vane, at your service, assuming you bring the reward." Harrow moved to the counter, the leather of his satchel creaking as he set it down. He needed a name. The blank line in the Bow Street ledger burned in his mind, a white void demanding to be filled with black ink, with fact, with a conclusion that would stop the screaming in the streets. Colquhoun had been clear. The city required a conclusion. Something must break. Better the suspect than order. "Describe him," Harrow said. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his satchel, the surface rough and unyielding. "The man who brought the spoons." Vane leaned forward, the candlelight catching the grease on his chin. Nervous fellow, shaking like a leaf in a gale, kept looking over his shoulder, expecting the devil himself to walk through that door. Vane paused, letting the silence stretch, testing the weight of his own words. "Said he found them, said they were a gift." "Found," Harrow repeated. The quill hovered above the paper. Ink gathered at the nib, a heavy black drop ready to fall. And the accent. "Welsh," Vane nodded, too quickly. "Thick as pea soup." "Where's the master?" he asked, rolling his RS until they sounded like stones in a bucket. "Definitely Welsh." Harrow pressed the nib to the page. Welsh accent. The letters formed slowly, the ink soaking into the fibers, turning the white void into a permanent record. As he wrote, he watched Vane's hands. They were clasped tightly on the counter, fingers twitching, thumbs rubbing together in a rhythmic, anxious motion. The man was not remembering, he was constructing. He was building a suspect out of air and expectation, shaping the description to fit the mold of what a murderer should sound like, what a monster should be, a Welsh sailor, a foreigner, someone who did not belong. "The clothing?" Harrow asked. His voice sounded flat in the cramped space. "Blue jacket," Vane said, seizing the opening to describe the coarse wool torn at the cuff. He wore trousers, dark grey and stained with tar, looking as though he'd just come off a collier while reeking of the river. Harrow wrote it down. Blue jacket, tar-stained trousers. Each word was a brick in a wall he was building around a stranger. He knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut, that Vane was lying about the accent. The man who had stood here an hour ago had spoken with the flat, hard vowels of the docks, of Limehouse or Ratcliffe, not the sing-song lilt of the valleys. But Vane saw the reward in Harrow's eyes, or perhaps he saw the desperation, and he offered up the detail that felt most dangerous, most likely to satisfy the hunger for a villain. "And the name?" Harrow asked. He did not look up from the paper. He could not meet Vane's gaze, not while he committed this fraud to parchment. "Didn't give a name at first," Vane said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that smelled of gin and decay. "But when I threatened to send for the watch, he spat it out, said it was Williams, John Williams, said he was discharged from the Sarah, a coal brig out of Sunderland." "John Williams." Harrow's hand paused. The ink pooled at the end of the surname, a small, dark lake that threatened to blot the page. He stared at the name. It was just a name, common, unremarkable. Thousands of men named John Williams walked the streets of London, drank in the pubs, slept in the lodging houses. But here on this page, in this specific configuration of letters, it became something else. It became a target. It became the answer to the question Colquhoun had posed: who is the wolf? "Discharged when?" Harrow asked. His throat felt dry. 2 days past, Vane said. Said he had no money, no lodgings, just the spoons. Harrow capped the sentence with a full stop. The period was a heavy dot, final and absolute. He blew gently on the wet ink, watching it lose its sheen, turning from liquid to solid fact. Once dry, this paper would travel to Bow Street. It would be filed. It would be read by Colquhoun, who would nod, who would sign a warrant, who would unleash the constables. The machinery of the law would grind forward, fueled by this lie, fueled by Vane's greed and Harrow's complicity. He folded the paper and slid it into his satchel. The movement felt clumsy, as if his hands no longer belonged to him. "You'll secure the reward?" Vane asked, his eyes following the satchel. "The magistrate authorized it, didn't he, for information leading to an arrest?" "If the information proves accurate," Harrow said. He stepped back from the counter, putting distance between himself and the man who had sold a soul for a few guineas. "Do not leave the premises, Mr. Vane. We may require your statement." "I'm not going anywhere," Vane said, a smile stretching his thin lips. "Not until I'm paid." Harrow turned and pushed open the door. The bell coughed again, a harsh, mocking sound. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street whole. The noise of the city was muffled, distant, as if the world had been wrapped in wool. He pulled his coat tighter, the damp chills seeping through the fabric, but the cold he felt was internal, a frost that had taken root in his chest the moment he wrote Welsh accent on the page. He walked away from the shop, his boots striking the cobbles with a rhythmic, hollow clatter. John Williams. The name echoed in his head, sinking with his stride. He had gone looking for a lead, a thread to pull that might unravel the mystery, but he had only found a noose, and he had tied the knot. Ahead, the silhouette of a constable emerged from the mist, waiting by the corner where the carriage to the lodging house would meet them. Harrow quickened his pace, the satchel heavy against his hip. He needed to get to the room. He needed to find the jacket. He needed to make the rest of the lie fit the shape of the name he had just invented. The fog swirled around his ankles, grey and suffocating, hiding the path forward, hiding the truth behind a wall of vapor that offered no resistance, only silence. Boiled cabbage. The smell hit them before the door opened, a thick, sweet rot that coated the throat and lingered in the nasal passages long after the breath was held. Harrow stood on the threshold of the lodging house in Ratcliffe Highway, watching Constable Higgs raise a fist to hammer on the warped wood. The lantern light caught the grime under Higgs's fingernails, black crescents that matched the soot staining the brickwork above the lintel. "Open up," Higgs said. He did not shout. The command was flat, heavy with the authority of the office, yet it lacked the force of true conviction. Bolts slid. The door cracked inward, revealing a sliver of yellow candlelight and the eye of a woman who looked as though she had been carved from tallow herself. She wore a mob cap stained with grease, her hands clutching the edges of a shawl that smelled of wet dog. "Who's asking?" Her voice was gravel in a tin cup. "Bow Street," Higgs said. He pushed the door wider, forcing the woman to stumble back into the hallway. "We need to see the sailor's room, top floor." "He's out." She did not move to let them pass. Her feet were bare on the flagstones, toes curling against the cold. "Rent's paid till Saturday. You've no right to pry." Harrow stepped past Higgs, brushing the woman's shoulder. The fabric of her shawl was damp. "We have cause to search, Mrs. Gain," she said. She turned, leading them towards the stairs. "And he's not a sailor, he's a worker, same as anyone else." The stairwell narrowed as they ascended. The plaster peeled away in long, dead-skin strips. They brushed against Harrow's coat. The darkness was not absolute. A single candle sputtered on a landing halfway up, its flame drowning in its own wax pool, casting shadows that stretched and contracted like breathing lungs. Harrow counted the steps. 14 to the next landing, 16 to the top. The numbers offered a semblance of order in a building that felt ready to collapse into the earth. Higgs took the lead. Moore brought up the rear. Harrow walked between them, the satchel from the pawnshop banging against his hip with every step. The sound was rhythmic, annoying. It reminded him of the ink drying on the ledger back at the shop, the permanent stain of Vane's lie now traveling with him into this warren of poverty. Room 4 was at the end of the corridor. The door stood ajar. Higgs kicked it open. The wood struck the inner wall with a dull thud. Clear, Moore said. He swept the lantern across the space. It was a single room, barely large enough to hold the bed and a splintered chair. The air inside was stale, trapped heat mixed with the metallic tang of old blood or perhaps just rusted iron. Harrow stepped in. His boots sank slightly into the straw mattress of the bed. The sheets were grey, twisted into knots where a sleeper had thrashed during the night. On the pillow lay the blue jacket. Harrow reached out. He touched the sleeve, coarse wool, rough against his fingertips. He lifted it. The cuff was torn just as Vane had described. A coincidence. It had to be. Thousands of men wore blue jackets with torn cuffs in London. But here in this room, under the flickering light of the constable's lantern, it looked like a confession. Jacket matches, Higgs said. He was leaning over the bed, his breath smelling of onions. What else? Harrow swept his gaze across the floor. A pair of trousers, stiff with dried mud. A pair of shoes, soleless. And on the washstand, resting beside a chipped basin of cloudy water, lay the hammer. It was a carpenter's claw hammer. The handle was beechwood, worn smooth by grip. The head was iron, dark and pitted. Harrow picked it up. The weight surprised him. It was heavier than it looked, balanced for swinging, for driving nails or crushing bone. He turned it over in his hand. There were no visible stains, no hair, no flesh, just iron and wood. "This it?" Moore asked. He shifted his weight. The floorboard creaked. Harrow looked at the hammer. He looked at the bed. He imagined the skull of William Marr, the fragility of the bone beneath the skin. This tool could do it. Any tool could do it. A brick, a stone, a fist. But this object, placed here in this room, belonging to the man named by the pawnbroker, it was an anchor. It would hold the narrative in place. "Wrap it," Harrow said. His voice sounded thin in the small room. Higgs pulled a length of coarse linen from his pocket. He took the hammer from Harrow's hand. The transfer was quick. The weight left Harrow's palm, but the sensation remained. He could still feel the vibration of the iron, the potential energy stored in the claw. "You're taking it." Mrs. Gain appeared in the doorway. She had followed them up. Her eyes were fixed on the hammer. "That's his tool. He needs that for work." "He won't be needing it tonight," Higgs said. He wrapped the linen tight around the head. "It's theft," she said. She did not raise her voice. There was no anger in it, only a weary resignation. "You come in here, you take his things, you say it's law, but it's just theft." Harrow turned to face her. He wanted to tell her that it was evidence. He wanted to explain the procedure, the chain of custody, the necessity of securing items for the magistrate, but the words stuck in his throat. She was right. They were taking a man's livelihood because it looked convenient, because Colquhoun needed a suspect, because Vane wanted a reward. "Secure the room," Harrow said. He turned away from her. He could not look at her eyes. "Post a watch outside. If he returns, hold him. Do not engage." "And if he runs?" Moore asked. "Let him run," Harrow said. "We have the tool." He walked out of the room. The corridor seemed narrower on the way back. The walls pressed in. He descended the stairs without counting the steps this time. The cabbage smell was stronger now, mixing with the scent of the linen-wrapped hammer in Higgs's bag. Outside, the fog had not lifted. It waited for them. Higgs joined him on the pavement, the bag swinging at his side. "Colquhoun will want to see it straight away," Higgs said. He wiped rain from his forehead. "Think it's enough." Harrow looked at the bag. The shape of the hammerhead was visible through the linen, a hard, dark lump. It was enough. It would have to be. The system would take this object and weave a story around it, a tapestry of guilt that would hang over the court until the rope was ready. "Take it to the office," Harrow said. "I'll meet you there." "You're not coming. I need air." Higgs shrugged. He turned towards Bow Street, his boots clattering on the cobbles. Moore followed. They disappeared into the mist, swallowed by the grey wool of the night. Harrow stood alone on the corner. The cold seeped through his boots. He flexed his fingers. The phantom weight of the hammer still pulled at his hand. He began to walk, not towards the office. Not yet. He needed to circle the block. He needed to wash the smell of that room from his clothes before he stood before the magistrate. He needed to pretend, for just a few minutes more, that he was a man of law and not a butcher's assistant sharpening the knife. A church bell tolled somewhere in the distance. The sound was muffled. It counted the hour. 1, 2, 3. The vibrations traveled through the fog, reaching him too late to be useful, marking time for a city that had already decided who was guilty. Harrow pulled his collar up. He walked into the dark, carrying the silence of what he had just done. The door to the magistrate's private chamber stuck against the frame, requiring a shoulder check to open. Harrow stumbled in, bringing a gust of damp wool and street filth with him. The room smelled of beeswax, stale tobacco, and the sharp, acrid tang of fresh ink. Colquhoun stood by the window, his back to the room, staring into the yellow soup of the night, as if he could command it to lift through sheer force of will. He did not turn when the constables entered, only when Higgs placed the linen-wrapped bundle on the desk with a heavy thud that shook the inkwell. "Show me," Colquhoun said. Higgs unwrapped the cloth. The hammer lay exposed under the guttering candlelight, the beechwood handle gleaming with the grease of 1,000 grips. Colquhoun picked it up. He swung it once, testing the balance, the iron head cutting a silent arc through the smoky air before he set it down again with a deliberate click. He reached for the blue jacket, running a thumb over the torn cuff, nodding as though the fabric itself had whispered a confession. "The pawnbroker's account matches," Harrow said. He kept his hands clasped behind his back to hide the trembling, and the lodging-house keeper identified the room as his. Colquhoun finally turned. His face was grey in the candlelight, the skin drawn tight over the bone, eyes bright with a feverish intensity that bordered on madness. He looked at the hammer, then at the jacket, and finally at Harrow. There was no question in his gaze, only a hungry demand for confirmation. "And the man, where is he?" "Gone, sir," Higgs said. "Room was empty. We've posted a watch." "Gone," Colquhoun tasted the word, rolling it around his mouth like sour wine. He walked to the desk and dipped a quill into the pot. The nib scratched against the paper, a dry, rat-like sound that filled the silence. Convenient. A sailor with a Welsh accent, a hammer in his room, silver spoons in a pawnshop, and now he vanishes into the fog. "It is a narrative gift, Mr. Harrow." Harrow stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "Sir, the hammer is a common tool. Any carpenter, any labourer in Wapping owns one just like it. The jacket is coarse wool, worn by half the docks. We have no eyewitness, no blood on the iron, no confession." Colquhoun stopped writing, his gaze fixed stubbornly on the desk. The quill hovered over the paper, a drop of black ink swelling at the tip, growing heavy, distended, ready to fall and ruin the page. "Do you think I do not know what a common hammer looks like?" Colquhoun's voice was low, a rumble of suppressed violence. "Do you think I am unaware of the abundance of blue jackets in this city? The people of Ratcliffe do not care for nuance, Mr. Harrow. They do not want a discussion on the prevalence of carpentry tools. They want a throat to cut. They want a name to scream at the moon while they board up their windows." He lifted the quill and signed the warrant with a flourish. The ink spread rapidly into the fibre of the paper, blooming outwards like a fresh bruise, dark and irreversible. He blew on the wet signature, the feathers of his breath disturbing the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. "Williams Fitz," Colquhoun said. He capped the inkwell with a sharp snap. "A sailor, a wanderer, a man with no fixed ties to tie him to respectability. He is the archetype of the danger we warn them about. If we do not give them Williams, they will tear the city apart looking for someone else, and they will not stop until they have hung an innocent child from a lamp post. Is that your preference, chaos or justice?" "It is not justice if he is innocent," Harrow said. The words felt clumsy in his mouth, inadequate against the wall of the magistrate's certainty. Justice is the absence of riot, Colquhoun snapped. He shoved the warrant across the desk. The paper slid over the polished wood, stopping just short of Harrow's fingers. Sign it. Authorize the arrest on sight. Let the constables have their prey. Harrow looked at the document. The name John Williams was written in his own hand from the earlier draft, now formalized by the magistrate's signature. The letters seemed to writhe under the flickering light, the loops of the W looking like nooses, the cross of the T like a grave marker. He reached for the quill. His hand felt numb, detached from his wrist, as if it belonged to another man, a stranger who did not know the weight of what he was about to do. The nib touched the paper. The scratch of the nib was loud, a tearing sound in the quiet room. He signed his name, Timothy Harrow. The ink flowed smooth and black, sealing the fate of a man he had never met, a man who might currently be shivering in a doorway 3 streets away, unaware that his life had just been reduced to a warrant on a desk. "Give it to Higgs," Colquhoun said. He turned back to the window, dismissing the moral weight of the act as easily as he dismissed the fog outside. "Tell them to bring him in, alive if possible, though I suspect the mob may have other ideas by the time they find him." Harrow folded the paper. The crease ran directly through the name Williams, slicing the man in two. He handed the warrant to Higgs, whose face was flushed with the thrill of the hunt, eyes bright with the promise of action. The constable snatched the paper, tucking it into his coat with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. "We'll have him before dawn," Higgs said. He grinned, a baring of teeth that held no humor, only hunger. "Don't worry, Mr. Harrow. We'll make it clean." Harrow said nothing. He watched them leave, the door clicking shut behind them, leaving him alone with the smell of ink and the dying candle. The flame sputtered, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls, shadows that seemed to stretch and grasp at him. He walked to the desk and ran a finger over the spot where the warrant had lain. The wood was still warm from the friction of the paper. Outside, the church bell tolled again, 4 strokes this time. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, up through the soles of his boots, settling deep in his marrow. He picked up his hat. The brim was damp, cold to the touch. He needed to go home. He needed to sit by his own fire and pretend that the ink on his fingers would wash off with soap and water, that the stain was only on the surface and not soaked into the bone. He blew out the candle. The room plunged into darkness, thick and suffocating. He fumbled for the door handle, his breath catching in his throat as his hand brushed the cold metal. The silence of the office pressed against his ears, heavier than the fog, heavier than the sea. He stepped out into the corridor, the warrant's ghost burning in his mind, and began the long walk back to his lodgings, dreading the letter he knew would be waiting on his table. The smell hit him first, a physical weight pressing against the palate before the grey light even resolved into shapes. Rotting kelp, sour beer, and the sweet, cloying stench of open sewers baking in the stagnant air of the low tide. Harrow gagged, swallowing hard, the taste of bile sharp at the back of his throat. He tightened his grip on the ledger, the leather cover slick with condensation, and stepped off the cobbles onto the sucking mud of the riverbank. "Keep moving," Higgs growled. The constable did not turn, his tricorn hat pulled low against the damp, his breath pluming white in the chill as he kicked at a bundle of rags tangled in the reeds. "Don't stop for nothing, not even if it looks like a body." It was a body, or had been. A dog, mostly, picked clean by the rats that scuttled unseen beneath the pilings, leaving only a scattered architecture of bone and matted fur. Harrow stepped over it, his boot sinking an inch into the sludge, the suction making a wet, tearing sound as he lifted his foot. He wiped the sole against the leg of his trousers, a futile gesture that only spread the grime. The dawn was not breaking, it was oozing. A sickly, bruised purple seeped into the sky above the masts of the colliers, illuminating the forest of rigging that swayed gently in the non-wind. The Thames lay exposed, a vast, heaving wound of black mud and trapped debris, glittering with broken glass and discarded iron hoops. It was ugly, it was honest, unlike the warrant in Higgs's pocket, which promised order but delivered only a hunt. "Boatman," Higgs shouted. The voice cracked, too loud in the stillness, startling a flock of gulls from the roof of a warehouse. They rose in a screaming cloud, wings beating a frantic rhythm against the grey. "You there, with the oars?" An old man shuffled out from the shadow of a waterman's hut, his face a map of deep lines carved by salt and wind. He held a pipe, unlit, clamped between yellow teeth, his eyes narrow slits assessing the threat. He wore a coat that might once have been blue, but was now the color of the mud itself, stiff with dried brine. "Ain't seen nothing," the boatman said. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the ground, missing Harrow's boot by inches. "Not unless you're looking for eels. Tide's out, everything's hiding." "We're looking for a sailor," Higgs said. He stepped closer, invading the old man's space, using his height to intimidate. "Name of Williams, Welsh maybe, dark hair, been drinking heavy, seen him." The boatman shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement of shoulders that suggested a lifetime of ignoring authority. "Sailors come and sailors go. Tide brings 'em, tide takes 'em. They all look alike in the dark, all got the same hunger in 'em." "Think," Higgs snapped. He tapped the pocket where the warrant rested. "This is Bow Street business. Obstruction is a fine offense, or worse." Harrow opened the ledger. The pages were damp, the paper warping slightly in the humidity. He dipped his pen into the inkwell secured at his belt, the nib trembling as he hovered it over the line. Questioned, waterman, unidentified, response, negative. He wrote the words, but the ink refused to dry. It sat on the surface of the paper, a glossy black bead that threatened to run. He blew on it, a sharp puff of air that did nothing but spread the smear, turning the letters into a blurred, weeping scar. He went towards the stairs, the boatman said suddenly. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble meant only for them, his eyes darting towards the cluster of alehouses huddled near Hermitage Lane. The one with the broken shutter, the Ship and Turtle. He was singing, off-key, sounded like a dying gull. Higgs grinned, a flash of triumph that looked grotesque on his weather-beaten face. "Which way?" "Down," the boatman said, jerking his thumb towards the narrow alleyway that sliced between two warehouses like a knife cut. "Before the fog got thick, maybe an hour back, said he needed a bed, said he needed to sleep it off before the hangman came." The words hung in the air, heavier than the fog. Before the hangman came, the boatman knew, they all knew. The city was a single organism, and fear was its blood, pumping through the streets, telling everyone what was coming before it arrived. Harrow wrote it down. Direction, Hermitage Stairs. Location, the Ship and Turtle. The ink ran again, pooling in the fiber of the page, obscuring the word turtle until it looked like trouble. He pressed the nib harder, trying to force clarity, but the paper absorbed the fluid greedily, drinking it down until the text was nothing but a dark, shapeless blot. It was like writing on skin, like writing on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Move out," Higgs ordered. He turned on his heel, mud splattering his coat, and marched towards the alley. "Stay close, Clark, and keep that book shut if we find him. I don't need you scratching notes while we're dragging him out." "Hollow," the word echoed in Harrow's skull as he followed. He stumbled over a loose cobble, catching himself against the rough brick of the warehouse wall. The texture was gritty, abrasive against his palm, grounding him for a second before the nausea returned. He was recording a death. Every word he put on this page was a brick in the wall they were building around John Williams. There would be no trial, not really. There would only be this ledger, this official record of a capture that everyone knew was a prelude to an execution. The alley narrowed, the sky above reduced to a sliver of grey wool. The smell here was different, concentrated. Stale ale, vomit, and the unwashed bodies of men who slept in their clothes. A cat darted across their path, its fur matted, eyes glowing green in the gloom before it vanished into a pile of refuse. "Check the door," Higgs whispered. He drew his truncheon, the wood creaking as he gripped it, quietly. Harrow stopped, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, bird-like panic that made his hands shake. He wanted to turn back. He wanted to run to the river and throw the ledger into the mud, let the tide take the evidence, let the truth dissolve in the salt water. But he stood still. His feet felt rooted to the spot, heavy with lead. The door to the Ship and Turtle was indeed broken, one shutter hanging by a single hinge, swinging gently in a draft that Harrow couldn't feel. Inside, the silence was absolute. No snoring, no movement, just the drip of water from a leaking roof, counting out seconds like a clock. "Tick, tick, tick." Higgs pushed the door. It groaned, the rusted hinges screaming in the quiet. He stepped inside, truncheon raised, silhouette framed against the dim interior. "Found him," Higgs said. His voice was flat, devoid of triumph now, just a statement of fact. "Asleep in the corner, like a babe." Harrow stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick, warm, and smelled of stale sweat and fear. He saw the figure slumped in the booth, head resting on the table, one arm dangling limp towards the floor. A man, small perhaps, not the monster the papers had painted, just a man who had drunk too much and fallen asleep in the wrong city at the wrong time. Harrow opened the ledger again. The page was wet, the ink still glistening. He had to write the time. He had to record the location. He had to make it real. He raised the pen, the nib hovering over the blank line, waiting to stain the next moment with permanence. The man on the table stirred. He lifted his head, blinking against the sudden intrusion of light and noise. His eyes were clear, wide, with a confusion that cut through Harrow's chest like a knife. "Who's there?" the man asked. His voice was rough with sleep, slurred but lucid. "What do you want?" Higgs didn't answer. He just moved forward, the truncheon ready. Harrow looked down at the page. The ink had finally stopped running, settling into a dark, irrevocable stain. He began to write, the scratch of the nib sounding like a rat gnawing at bone in the sudden, terrible silence of the room. Higgs moved faster than a man of his girth had any right to, the truncheon a blur of dark wood before it cracked against the table edge, not the man, a warning shot that sent a tankard skittering across the floorboards. "Up," Higgs growled. "On your feet, Williams, by order of the magistrate." The sailor blinked, the sleep shedding from him like wet wool, and he pushed himself upright with hands that trembled not from guilt, but from the sudden, violent intrusion of authority into his private stupor. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon, nor did he attempt to vault the booth or smash a window, actions a guilty man fleeing a double butchery might well consider. Instead, he simply sat there, rubbing the heel of his palm into his eye socket, leaving a smear of grime on his forehead, looking for all the world like a laborer woken before his shift by a foreman with a grudge. "What is this?" Williams asked, his voice cracked, dry and thin. "I've paid my score." "You're coming with us," Higgs said. He signaled to the second constable, a younger man named Miller whose face was pale beneath the grime of the street. "Iron him." Miller stepped forward, the heavy manacles dangling from his belt clinking with a sound that seemed to suck the air out of the room. The metal was cold, dull grey against the warm, beer-stained wood of the table. Williams watched the irons approach, his confusion deepening into a quiet, baffled terror. He held out his wrists, palms up, a gesture of submission so complete it made Harrow's stomach turn over. There was no struggle, no defiance. Just the mechanical click of the lock engaging, the ratchet teeth biting into the steel, sealing the man's fate with a finality that no amount of shouting could undo. Harrow's quill hovered. The nib dripped a single, fat drop of black onto the ledger, blooming instantly into a perfect, dark sphere. Time of apprehension, 07:14. He wrote the numbers, the ink sliding over the damp paper, the letters forming themselves with a will of their own. He recorded the location, the ship and turtle, and the condition of the prisoner compliant. No resistance offered. The words looked absurd on the page. Compliant. As if compliance proved guilt. As if a man who did not fight back was admitting to slicing throats in the dark. Williams twisted his wrists, testing the bonds, the chain between them rattling softly. He looked past Higgs, past Miller, fixing his gaze directly on Harrow. His eyes were blue, startlingly clear in the gloom of the alehouse, rimmed with red, but devoid of the madness the broadsheets had promised. They were the eyes of a man who had lost his berth, perhaps, or his wages to a card sharp, but not the eyes of a butcher. "Sir," Williams said, addressing Harrow directly, ignoring the constables who now flanked him like jailers. "You're the clerk from Bow Street." Harrow froze. The quill stopped mid-stroke, a jagged line tearing through the fiber of the page. "I know you," Williams insisted, leaning forward as much as the chains allowed, the smell of stale ale and sour sweat rolling off him in waves. "You took my deposition last week, about the missing coat. You said you'd look into it." A lie or a desperate grasp at straws? Harrow had seen 100 sailors, 100 desperate men claiming theft and loss. He did not know this man. He had never seen him before this morning. But the specificity of the plea, the anchoring of it in a mundane, bureaucratic memory, struck Harrow with the force of a physical blow. It was an attempt to humanize himself, to pull his identity back from the abyss of the monster and into the realm of the ordinary citizen with a grievance. Higgs shoved Williams back, the truncheon pressing hard against the sailor's chest. "Save it for the magistrate, no chatter." "I haven't done anything," Williams said, his voice rising, cracking on the edge of a shout. "I slept here, ask the landlord. I've been here since dusk. I didn't go near Ratcliffe." "Move," Higgs ordered. He grabbed Williams by the collar of his jacket, yanking him out of the booth. The sailor stumbled, his boots catching on the sawdust floor, and went down to one knee before Miller hauled him up by the chain. The metal bit into his skin. Harrow saw the white indent appear, then the slow bloom of red beneath the cuff. Harrow closed the ledger. The leather cover made a heavy, dull thud as it snapped shut, severing the connection between the ink and the air. He tucked the book under his arm, the dampness of the page soaking through his sleeve, chilling his skin. He should speak. He should note the alibi. He should record the man's claim of being in the alehouse since dusk, a fact that could be verified, a thread that might unravel this entire tangled mess. "Record the truth," the voice in his head whispered. "That is the duty." But the duty was not to the truth. The duty was to the order, to Colquhoun, to the city that was holding its breath, waiting for a head on a spike to stop the shaking of its foundations. If he wrote the alibi, it would be questioned, then investigated, then dismissed as the lies of a killer, and in the dismissal, the doubt would spread. The mob would not wait for the investigation to conclude. They would tear the office apart. They would burn the streets. Harrow adjusted his grip on the ledger. His fingers were stained black, the ink having seeped under his fingernails, embedding itself in the cuticles like a permanent bruise. He looked at his hand, mesmerized by the stain. It looked like blood that had dried too quickly, turning black and crusty. "Let's go," Higgs said. He dragged Williams towards the door, the sailor's boots scraping a long, jagged line in the dirt floor. "Keep your head down, prisoner, or I'll break your legs to help you along." Williams twisted his neck, straining to keep Harrow in his line of sight as they hauled him towards the light of the street. "Sir, please, you know the procedure. Check the book. The landlord knows me." Harrow kept his gaze fixed downward. He focused on the stain on his thumb, rubbing it futilely against the wool of his coat, trying to wipe away the black mark, but it only smeared, spreading the darkness further across the fabric. "Walk," Miller snapped. He jerked the chain, pulling Williams's head down. They moved out into the alley, the grey light of morning hitting them like a wet cloth. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the jagged outlines of the rooftops, but the air remained thick, clinging to the skin. Harrow followed them, his steps measured, precise. He counted his paces. 1, 2, 3, keeping the rhythm of the march, the rhythm of the machine that was now grinding forward, unstoppable. Behind them, the door to the Ship and Turtle swung shut, the broken hinge groaning once more before settling into silence. Inside, the empty booth sat waiting, the warmth of the sleeping man still lingering on the wood, fading fast in the cold draft. Harrow opened the ledger again as they reached the street, needing to fill the space, needing to drown out the sound of the chains with the scratch of the pen. He wrote, "Prisoner secured," conveying to the magistrate's court at Covent Garden. He did not write the plea. He did not write the alibi. He left the page clean, pristine, a lie polished to a shine. Williams stumbled over a rut in the road, cursing softly, a stream of invective that sounded tired rather than angry. Higgs laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. "Save your breath, Jack," Higgs said. "You'll need it for the noose." Harrow's hand cramped. The quill dug into the paper, tearing a small hole near the margin. He stared at the tear, a tiny white eye staring back at him from the black text. He thought of the tide, low and receding, leaving the filth of the riverbed exposed to the sun. He thought of the ink, spreading like a bruise, staining everything it touched, turning the white of the page into something dark and irreversible. They turned the corner onto Hermitage Street, the main thoroughfare ahead crowded with early morning traffic. Carts rumbled past, horses snorting steam into the chill air, drivers shouting over the clatter of wheels. Nobody looked at them, nobody stopped. They saw the constables, the prisoner, the clerk, and they looked away, pulling their collars up, hastening their pace. They knew better. To look was to invite trouble. To acknowledge the net tightening was to admit you might be caught in it yourself. Harrow walked faster, catching up to Higgs, his shoes slipping on the wet cobbles. He needed to get to the office. He needed to put the ledger on the desk. He needed to hand it to Colquhoun and let the magistrate take the weight of it. "Sir," Williams called out again, his voice desperate now, stripped of its earlier confusion. Tell Colquhoun I was here all night." Harrow kept walking. He focused on the black stain on his thumb, the one he could not scrub away. He told himself it was just ink, just fluid and fiber, just a mark made by a pen. But as the wagon came into view, waiting by the curb with its slatted sides and heavy iron bolts, Harrow knew the stain was deeper than that. It was on his soul, and it was spreading. He climbed into the wagon after them, the wood creaking under his weight, and sat opposite the prisoner. The door slammed shut, plunging them into semi-darkness, the only light filtering through the gaps in the slats, cutting across Williams's face in bars of grey. "Drive on," Higgs shouted from outside. The wheels lurched forward, the motion throwing Harrow against the side of the carriage. He gripped the ledger tight, holding it against his chest like a shield or perhaps a weapon. Williams looked at him, the bars of light shifting across his eyes as the wagon bumped over the stones. He stopped struggling. He stopped shouting. He just sat there, watching Harrow with those terrible, clear blue eyes, waiting for a word that would not come. The wagon picked up speed, rattling towards the prison, towards the cell, towards the end. Harrow opened his mouth to speak, to offer some small comfort, some lie of reassurance, but nothing came out. The silence in the wagon was absolute, heavier than the iron chains, heavier than the fog, heavier than the truth. The wheels hit a pothole near Bishopsgate, jarring Harrow's spine against the slatted wood. "Steady," Higgs barked from the driver's box, though the command did little to smooth the rutted path. Inside the box, the air grew thick with the smell of unwashed wool and the sour tang of Williams's fear, a sharp, acidic scent that clawed at the back of Harrow's throat. He shifted his weight, trying to find a position that did not require him to look directly at the prisoner, but the cramped space offered no refuge. Every movement brought him closer to the man he had helped cage. Williams sat hunched, his hands bound behind his back, the iron cuffs biting into wrists already raw from the struggle at the alehouse. He did not speak. He merely breathed, a ragged, hitching sound that filled the small space between them, louder than the clatter of hooves on the cobbles. Harrow opened the ledger on his knees. The page waited, white and accusing. He dipped the quill into the inkwell secured in the box's floor, the nib scratching as it found purchase. Conveyance to Bow Street office effected without incident. The lie flowed smooth, black and glossy. It dried too fast in the draft, turning matte and final. "Is that it?" Williams asked. His voice was thin, stripped of the bluster sailors used to command the rigging. "Just without incident." Harrow kept writing. He added the time. He added the names of the constables. He did not add the tremor in the prisoner's hands or the way the man's eyes had pleaded for a mercy the law no longer possessed. "Write it down," Williams said, leaning forward until the chains pulled taut, rattling against the floorboards. "Write that I told you, write that I was at the Ship and Turtle from sunset to sunrise. The landlord saw me, the girl serving the gin saw me." "The magistrate will hear your statement," Harrow said. The words tasted like ash. "Hear it?" Williams let out a short, bitter laugh that ended in a cough. "They won't hear nothing but what they want to hear. You know that, Clark. You've been there long enough to know how the wind blows." Harrow stopped writing. The quill hovered over the paper, a drop of ink swelling at the tip, threatening to fall and ruin the neat column of falsehoods. He looked up, meeting Williams's gaze. The man's eyes were indeed clear, a startling, watery blue that seemed to cut through the grime of the cell and the fog of the street. There was no madness in them, no bloodlust, only a terrified, lucid confusion. "I am a clerk," Harrow said, his voice flat. "I record, I do not judge." "You record lies," Williams spat. "You write productive of suspicion when there is nothing but air. You write resisted arrest when I stood still, What happens when you write guilty? Will the ink make it true? The wagon lurched again, throwing Harrow against the side. The ink drop fell, splattering onto the page, a dark star bursting in the margin. Harrow stared at it. It looked like a bruise. It looked like the bloodstain on the Marr family's doorstep that he had seen in the sketches, the one that had started this entire fever dream. Silence, Harrow said, but the command lacked authority. It was a plea. They arrived at the Bow Street office just as the sky began to lighten, the grey deepening into a bruised purple. The building loomed, its windows dark save for the flicker of candlelight on the upper floor where Colquhoun waited. The constables disembarked first, hauling Williams out by the arms. He stumbled on the step, his boots slipping on the wet stone, but he recovered quickly, straightening his spine with a dignity that made Harrow's stomach turn. Inside, the office was a hive of frantic activity. Runners dashed in and out, carrying reports that were already obsolete. The air smelled of stale tobacco, damp coats, and the metallic tang of anxiety. Colquhoun stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, staring into the dying embers as if seeking an omen in the ash. He turned as they entered, his face drawn, the skin beneath his eyes grey and slack. "Bring him here," Colquhoun said. His voice was low, devoid of the boom that usually commanded a courtroom. They shoved Williams forward. He stood before the magistrate, shivering slightly, his clothes torn and stained with the mud of the docks. Colquhoun circled him, a predator inspecting prey that did not quite match the description of the kill. He stopped in front of Williams, leaning in close, sniffing the air around the prisoner as if expecting to smell the blood of the Marrs. "Search him," Colquhoun ordered, "thoroughly." Higgs and Miller set to work, their hands rough and impatient. They patted down Williams's coat, feeling the seams, checking the pockets. They removed a clasp knife, a length of twine, a handkerchief stained with tar. They checked his boots, lifting his feet, probing the soles. They ran their hands down his trousers, squeezing the fabric, looking for the hard outline of stolen metal or the wet stickiness of fresh blood. "Nothing." Higgs stepped back, holding up the meager collection of items. "Nothing, sir. No blood, no goods, just sailor's trash." Colquhoun's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek, a frantic pulse beneath the pale skin. He looked at Williams, then at the empty space where evidence should have been, then at Harrow. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. The clock on the mantel ticked, a dry wooden sound that seemed to count down the seconds of Colquhoun's crumbling authority. "Record it," Colquhoun snapped. He turned away, walking back to the fire, his shoulders hunched against the cold that no flame could dispel. "Record the search as productive of suspicion." Harrow froze. The quill felt heavy in his hand, a lead weight dragging his arm down. "Sir." "You heard me," Colquhoun said, not turning around. The manner of his dress, the location of his capture, the absence of an alibi that can be immediately verified, it is all suspicious. Write it down. Search productive of suspicion. Williams made a sound, a low groan of disbelief. "There's nothing there. Look at me, I'm clean." "Sit him," Colquhoun muttered. "Put him on the bench. Keep him warm. We cannot have him dying before the hearing." Harrow moved to the cupboard and retrieved a rough wool blanket, grey and scratchy. He approached Williams, who was now slumped on the wooden bench, his head in his hands. Harrow draped the blanket over the prisoner's shoulders. The wool smelled of mothballs and old sweat, but it was better than nothing. Williams looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden, fragile gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "Take that off," Colquhoun barked, spinning around. His face was flushed now, a patch of angry red on his cheekbones. "He is a prisoner under suspicion of capital murder. He does not get comforts. He gets the cold truth of his position." Harrow hesitated, his hand still on the blanket. He looked at Colquhoun, seeing the desperation there, the raw, naked need for this man to be guilty so that the city could breathe again. If Williams was guilty, the panic would subside. The mobs would disperse. The trade would resume. If Williams was innocent, then the killer was still out there, and the terror was justified, and Colquhoun's life's work was a sham. Harrow slowly pulled the blanket away. Williams shivered as the warmth vanished, his shoulders hunching inward again. "Write it, Harrow," Colquhoun said, his voice trembling with a force that was barely contained. "Write the phrase, now." Harrow sat at the desk. The inkwell sat before him, a pool of black infinity. He dipped the quill. The nib touched the paper. He wrote the words, each letter a betrayal, each loop of the P, and Sir nail in the coffin of his own conscience. Search productive of suspicion. The ink flowed, dark and irrevocable, staining the page just as the lie stained the air. He looked up. Williams was watching him, the blanket gone, the cold seeping into his bones. There was no anger in the sailor's face now, only a profound, exhausting resignation. He knew. He understood that the machinery had clicked into place, that the gears were turning regardless of the truth of the cogs. Harrow capped the inkwell. The click of the lid sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. "Take him to the holding cell," Colquhoun said, turning his back on them all to stare once more into the dying fire. "Prepare the wagon for cold bath. He is to be transferred immediately." Harrow stood. His legs felt stiff, as if the ink had seeped into his joints, locking them in place. He walked over to Williams, avoiding the man's eyes. "Up," Harrow said softly. Williams rose, the blanket falling to the floor in a crumpled heap. He did not pick it up. He simply followed Higgs towards the door, his steps heavy, the chains dragging behind him like a tail of iron. As he passed Harrow, he paused, just for a fraction of a second. "You know," Williams whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "You know I am not him." Harrow did not answer. He could not. He picked up the ledger, clutching it to his chest, feeling the wet ink still tacky against his palm. He followed them out into the corridor, where the shadows were long and the air was cold, walking towards the wagon that would take the innocent man to his grave. The wheels of the carriage waited outside, silent and still, ready to roll over the cobblestones and grind the city's last hope into dust. The chain dragged, a rusty iron rasp against flagstone that skipped every third step, a syncopated rhythm of captivity that drilled straight into the base of Harrow's skull. Scrape, drag, pause, scrape. Coldbath Fields smelled of wet lime and the sour, fermented breath of men who had forgotten the taste of clean air. It was a different stench entirely from the coal smoke fog of Wapping. Here, the damp did not cling to the coat, but settled inside the lungs, a cold weight that no fire could shift. Harrow sat at a deal table bolted to the floor, the wood scarred by previous scribes who had carved their boredom or their despair into the grain. His candle, a tallow stub guttering in a draught that seemed to find its way through the very mortar, cast a jaundiced light that barely reached the corners of the cell. Shadows stretched long and thin, distorting the figure of John Williams into something taller, jagged, a giant pacing a cage. "Stop it," Harrow said. He did not look up from the ledger. Williams halted mid-stride. The silence that rushed in to fill the gap was heavier than the noise, pressing against Harrow's eardrums until they popped. The sailor stood by the far wall, his chest heaving beneath a shirt that had seen better days, the fabric stiff with salt and grime. He looked at the shackle on his ankle, then at Harrow, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "It moves when I move, Mr. Clark," Williams said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by shouting denials to the mob that had chased him from the highway to this stone box. "You want me to hover, like a ghost. I want you to sit. The noise makes the writing impossible." "Writing," Williams spat the word. He took 2 steps towards the bench, the chain clattering loudly, deliberately this time, a spike of defiance in the grey room. "What are you writing now? Another lie to sell to the papers? Another story about how I smiled while I cracked their skulls?" Harrow dipped his quill. The ink was thick, congealing slightly in the chill of the cell, and it required a firm hand to coax a line onto the page. He watched the black fluid well up at the nib, remembering how it had looked on the Marr family's floorboards, that terrible spreading bruise of blood that the river tide had failed to wash away. Now he was making more of it, turning a man's life into a series of loops and strokes that would hang him higher than the gallows ever could. "I am recording your statement," Harrow said, keeping his tone flat, bureaucratic, "as ordered by Magistrate Colquhoun." "Statement," Williams laughed, a dry, cracking sound that held no humor. He sank onto the straw-stuffed mattress, the springs groaning in protest. "I told you everything. I told you where I was. I told you about the pawnshop. I told you about the girl. Does any of it go in the book, Timothy, or does the book only take the bits that fit the shape you've already cut out?" Harrow's hand faltered. A single drop of ink fell from the nib, landing on the parchment with a soft plip, blooming into a perfect, dark sphere that slowly ate into the fiber of the paper. He stared at it, mesmerized by its hunger. It looked like an eye. A blind, black eye staring back at him, accusing him of the complicity he had been trying to drown in procedure since the first body was found. The magistrate requires clarity, Harrow muttered, reaching for the sand shaker to blot the mistake. Emotion clouds the record. Clarity, Williams surged forward, the chain snapping taut with a violent jerk that sent a shower of rust dust onto the floor. He gripped the iron bar of the window, his knuckles white against the grime. There is a mob outside, man. Can you not hear them? They are screaming for my blood. They don't want clarity. They want a head on a spike to make the fear go away. The shouting from the yard beyond the thick walls was indeed audible now, a muffled roar like the sea breaking against a cliff, distant but relentless. It vibrated through the stone, up through the legs of the table, into Harrow's bones. He could picture them out there, the shipwrights, the dockhands, the terrified shopkeepers of Ratcliffe, their faces twisted in a collective hysteria that demanded a sacrifice. They needed Williams to be the monster. If he was not, then the monster was still out there, walking the fog-choked streets, watching them through their unlit windows, waiting for the next chance to strike. They will not break the door, Harrow said, though he did not believe it. The turnkeys are armed. Armed with what? Pikes? Muskets? Williams turned from the window, his face a mask of exhausted fury. There are thousands of them, Harrow, thousands, and inside here there is only you, me, and this. He gestured wildly at the ledger, the inkwell, the pathetic flickering candle. This pretense of justice. Harrow pressed the quill harder against the paper, the nib scratching a harsh, rat-like sound that seemed to echo Williams's accusation. Denial reiterated. Prisoner exhibits signs of agitation. The words looked frail, insubstantial against the reality of the man's terror. He was capturing the shell of the event, but losing the soul of it, distilling a human being into a legal abstraction that would be signed, sealed, and used to justify a murder sanctioned by the state. Sit down, Williams, Harrow said, his voice tighter now, a thread about to snap. Please, if you agitate yourself, I cannot. The record must be accurate. Accurate? Williams slumped back onto the mattress, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only a profound, hollowed-out weariness. He stared at his shackled foot, watching the iron bite into his swollen ankle. Nothing about this is accurate. You know it, I know it. Even that old devil Colquhoun knows it, deep down in his gut where he keeps his soul rotting. He looked up, locking eyes with Harrow. For a moment, the air between them seemed to solidify, charged with the unspoken truth that hung heavier than the smell of damp straw. Williams's gaze was not angry anymore, it was pitying. He saw Harrow not as an officer of the law, but as another prisoner, trapped in a cell of his own making, bound by chains of ink and protocol that were just as unbreakable as the iron on his leg. You are a good man, Timothy Harrow, Williams whispered, the words barely audible over the distant roar of the crowd. That is the tragedy of it. You are a good man doing the devil's work because you think it keeps the world orderly. Harrow opened his mouth to refute him, to cite the statutes, the duty, the necessity of the Bow Street office in maintaining the fragile peace of the metropolis. But the words died in his throat, choked off by the sight of the ink stain on the page, which had spread further, branching out like a vein, like a crack in a dam. He looked at his own hand, resting on the ledger, and saw the black smudges on his fingers, permanent marks that no amount of washing would ever remove. The candle is low, Harrow said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, detached and thin. I must trim the wick. He reached for the snuffers, his movements stiff, mechanical. The flame danced wildly as the draught caught it, throwing Williams's shadow huge and distorted against the far wall, a giant looming over the small, broken man on the bed. The shadow's arms stretched out, grasping, reaching, as if trying to tear the stone apart. Don't bother, Williams said, closing his eyes. Let it go out. Maybe in the dark, they'll stop looking for a monster and see that there's only a man left to kill. Harrow froze, the cold metal of the snuffers in his hand. The roar outside swelled, a sudden crest of noise that shook the dust from the ceiling, and for a terrifying second, the candle flame dipped so low it was nothing but a blue ember struggling in the gloom. The darkness pressed in from the corners, hungry and absolute, waiting for the final breath of light to fail so that the real work could begin. The heavy iron bolt slid back with a shriek that set Harrow's teeth on edge, a sound like bone dragged across slate. The door swung inward. Magistrate Colquhoun filled the frame, his greatcoat damp with the evening mist, smelling of wet wool and the sharp, acrid tang of the torches burning in the corridor behind him. He did not step inside immediately. He stood there, letting the cold draft from the hallway extinguish the warmth of the cell, his gaze sweeping the small room, the cowering figure on the straw, and Harrow frozen with the snuffers in his hand. "Leave the wick," Colquhoun said. His voice was flat, stripped of the rhetorical flourishes he used in the courtroom. "We have no time for trimming." Williams did not open his eyes. He sat hunched on the mattress, his knees drawn up to his chest, looking smaller than the sailor who had been dragged in 2 days prior, shorn of his defiance, shorn even of his anger. "Magistrate," Harrow said, lowering the snuffers to the table. The metal clicked against the wood. "The prisoner is exhausted. He requires rest if we are to take a proper deposition." Colquhoun stepped into the room, the door thudding shut behind him, sealing them once more in the close, fetid air. He walked to the table, ignoring Williams entirely, and placed a gloved hand on the ledger. The leather of his glove creaked. "There will be no deposition, Harrow, not of the sort you imagine." He turned then, fixing his gaze on the man on the bed. "John Williams, do you hear me?" Williams flinched, a minute twitch of the shoulder, nothing more. "The yard is full," Colquhoun said, his tone conversational, as if discussing the price of coal or the state of the tide. "I counted 300 men at the gate, shipwrights from the East India docks, lightermen from Wapping. They have brought ropes, Williams, heavy hempen ropes. They have brought stones." Harrow felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He looked at the magistrate, seeing the sweat beading on the man's upper lip despite the chill of the room. Colquhoun was afraid. The realization hit Harrow with the force of a physical blow. The great architect of the river police, the man who had lectured Parliament on the civilizing power of order, was terrified of the mob he claimed to protect. "They are screaming your name," Colquhoun continued, leaning forward slightly, his hands braced on the table. "They are calling for blood. They do not care for your denials. They do not care for the lack of evidence. To them, you are already dead. You are merely a piece of meat waiting to be hung from the lamp post outside the King's Arms." Williams lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, the whites yellowed by fatigue and the foul air. "Then let them come," he croaked. "If I am to die, let it be by their hands. At least it will be honest." "Honest?" Colquhoun let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "There is no honesty in a lynching, man. There is only butchery. They will tear you limb from limb before the sun rises. They will drag your entrails through the gutters of Ratcliffe Highway while your mother watches from a window she cannot afford to light." He paused, letting the image settle, letting it sink into the straw and the stone and the marrow of the prisoner. "But," Colquhoun said, softening his voice, adopting the tone of a father speaking to a wayward son, "the law offers protection. The walls of Coldbath Fields are thick. The turnkeys are loyal to me. As long as you remain within the jurisdiction of the court, as long as you are under my specific charge, I can hold them back. I can keep the mob at bay." Harrow watched the trap snap shut. It was so simple, so elegant in its cruelty, that he felt sick. The magistrate was offering safety in exchange for guilt. Confess, and you live another day within these walls. Deny, and the gates open to the butchers. "What do you want?" Williams whispered. The fight had gone out of him, drained away like water from a broken bucket. He looked at his shackled feet, at the rusted iron that bound him to the floor of his own destruction. "Want the truth," Colquhoun lied. The words slid off his tongue with practiced ease. "I want you to spare the city further panic. Sign the confession, Williams. Admit to the Marrs, admit to the Williamsons. Do this and you remain here safe behind these bars, awaiting the due process of the King's justice. Refuse, and I cannot promise what happens when the crowd breaches the gate. And breach it they will. They are desperate men, terrified men. They need a monster to kill so they can sleep tonight." The silence that stretched between them was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, like the air before a storm breaks. Harrow could hear the blood rushing in his own ears, a dull roar that matched the distant chanting of the crowd outside. He looked at his quill, lying on the ledger next to the fresh, wet ink of his last note. Prisoner exhibits signs of agitation. It was a lie. The man was not agitated. He was broken. Sign it, Colquhoun urged, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Save yourself the rope of the mob. Give us the peace we require, and we will give you the shelter of the law. Williams stared at the magistrate for a long moment. His face was a mask of utter desolation, the features slack, the eyes devoid of hope. He understood. They all understood. The law was not a shield. It was a cage, and the key was a lie written in black ink. Slowly, painfully, Williams shifted his weight. The chain rattled, a dull, dead sound against the stone floor. He reached out a trembling hand, not towards the pen, but towards his own face, covering his eyes as if to blot out the sight of the two men who stood over him, one in a greatcoat of authority, the other in a coat stained with the ink of complicity. "You would have me hang by the neck until dead," Williams said, his voice hollow, echoing in the small space. "But you wish to choose the rope." "I wish to preserve order," Colquhoun corrected sharply. "Is that not your duty as well, Harrow?" The question hung in the air, directed at the clerk. Harrow felt the weight of the magistrate's gaze, demanding assent, demanding participation. He looked at Williams, at the slumped shoulders, the head bowed in defeat. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say that the law demanded proof, that a man was innocent until proven guilty, that they could not coerce a confession under threat of mob violence. The words formed in his mind, clear and bright. No. But they never reached his lips. Harrow looked down at the ledger. The page waited, white and accusing. He picked up the quill. The feather felt light, insubstantial, a fragile thing against the weight of the moment. He dipped the nib into the inkwell. The black fluid clung to the steel, glossy and deep. "Record this," Colquhoun commanded. Harrow touched the nib to the paper. The ink bloomed instantly, a dark stain spreading into the fibers. He began to write, his hand moving with a mechanical precision that felt detached from his will. The prisoner, upon being apprised of the danger posed by the assembled populace, did express a willingness to provide a full account of his actions. The scratch of the nib was loud in the silence. It sounded like a rat gnawing at bone, relentless, hungry. Williams kept his gaze fixed on the floorboards. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, palms open, as if waiting to receive a blessing or a blow. The candle flame guttered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe, to lean in closer. "Is that sufficient?" Colquhoun asked, watching the ink flow. "For now," Harrow murmured. He did not recognize his own voice. It sounded thin, reedy, like the voice of a stranger. "Good." Colquhoun straightened his coat, smoothing the lapels. "We shall return in the morning. Perhaps by then, the man will have found his courage." He turned to the door, pausing only to glance back at Williams. "Think on it, sailor. The mob waits for no man, but the law can be patient, if you let it." The bolt slid back. The door opened. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the distant, rhythmic chanting of the crowd, a low drone that vibrated through the floorboards. Colquhoun stepped out into the corridor, the light from the torches flaring behind him, and the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place with a finality that echoed in Harrow's chest. Harrow was alone with him again. He looked down at the page. The words he had written sat there, neat and formal, a legal fiction that would be used to seal a man's fate. The ink was still wet, glistening in the candlelight like a fresh wound. He looked at Williams. The sailor had not moved. He sat in the same posture, head bowed, hands open. But there was a change in the air, a shift in the pressure. The despair that had filled the room moments before had solidified into something harder, something colder, a resolution. Williams slowly raised his head. He looked at Harrow, and for the first time there was no pity in his eyes, only a terrible, quiet knowing. "You have your record, Mr. Harrow," Williams said softly. "Now you must live with it." He turned his gaze away, looking past the table, past the candle, to the far wall where the shadows danced and writhed. He reached up and touched the coarse fabric of his waistcoat, his fingers tracing the line of a seam. Harrow watched him, the quill still poised in his hand, the ink dripping onto the page, forming a new dark blot that spread like a bruise. The candle flame flickered violently, threatened by a draft that had no source, and then, with a sudden hiss, it died. Darkness swallowed the cell. In the blackness, Harrow heard the sound of fabric tearing. The bolt slammed home, iron on iron, a final, dull thud that severed the corridor from the cell, leaving Harrow alone in the sudden, suffocating quiet. He stood up, his knees cracked, a dry snap in the stillness, and the movement sent a fresh wave of cramp shooting up his calf. He needed air, not the thick, recycled stalemate of the cell, heavy with the smell of unwashed wool and the copper tang of fear, but the damp, mouldering draft of the hallway. Anything to escape the sight of Williams's hands, those open palms waiting for a blow that had already landed in spirit, if not in flesh. Harrow pushed the ledger shut. The leather cover made a wet slapping sound against the wood. He kept his eyes fixed on the grain of the table, refusing to meet the sailor's gaze. To do so now, in the aftermath of Colquhoun's surgical dismantling of hope, felt like an intrusion too far, a violation of a privacy that no longer existed. He walked to the door and rapped the hilt of his pen against the timber. "Guard," he called out, his voice sounding thin, stripped of the authority he usually borrowed from the office. "I require a moment." The slot above the lock slid open. A pair of bloodshot eyes, rimmed with the fatigue of a double shift, peered in. "Orders are strict, Clark, no one out." "I'm not leaving the wing," Harrow snapped, the irritation flaring hot and sudden. "I am stretching my legs. If the magistrate asks, tell him I am verifying the structural integrity of the corridor, or tell him I have fled. I care little which, so long as you open this door." The guard hesitated, the slime of indecision visible in the way his jaw worked, before the bolt scraped back. The door groaned inward. Harrow squeezed past the man, catching the scent of stale beer and onion on his breath, and stepped into the passage. Coldbath Fields breathed differently than the street. The air here was stagnant, trapped beneath the low brick arches, tasting of limewash, human waste, and the sour milk of despair. It clung to the back of the throat, a physical weight that made swallowing difficult. Harrow walked away from the cell, his boots clicking on the flagstones, the sound echoing too loudly in the narrow space. He counted his steps. 1, 2, 3, anything to impose a rhythm on the chaos churning in his gut. He passed the adjacent cells. In one, a man coughed, a wet, rattling sound that ended in a spit against the straw. In another, a woman murmured to herself, a low, repetitive drone that might have been a prayer or a curse, the words blurred beyond recognition by the thick stone walls. These sounds usually faded into the background noise of the prison, part of the ambient hum of incarceration that Harrow had learned to ignore. Tonight, they grated. They sounded like accusations. "You have your record, Mr. Harrow. Now you must live with it." The words looped in his mind, syncing with the click of his heels. He stopped beneath a lantern fixed to the wall, its glass clouded with grease and soot, casting a sickly yellow pool of light that barely reached the floor. He held out his hands. They were black. Not with dirt, not with the grime of the street or the dust of the prison. The ink had migrated. It had seeped from the nib, across his fingers, and crept up the sides of his palms like a slow-moving tide, settling into the creases of his skin, staining the whorls of his finger marks until his own identity seemed obscured by the pigment of his trade. He stared at them, mesmerized and horrified. The stain looked less like a spill and more like a bruise, a deep, necrotic discoloration that suggested the blood beneath had turned to something thicker, darker. He grabbed his handkerchief from his pocket, linen, white, monogrammed with a T that his sister had stitched with trembling fingers before he left for Bow Street that morning. He spat onto the fabric and rubbed vigorously at his right wrist. The friction burned, raising a raw red patch on the skin, but the blackness remained. It did not smear. It did not lift. It seemed to have bonded with the flesh, sinking past the epidermis into the muscle, into the bone. "Damn it," he hissed, scrubbing harder until his knuckles whitened. It was useless. The more he rubbed, the more permanent the mark appeared, as if the ink was feeding on his panic, growing deeper with every frantic motion. He stopped, his chest heaving, the handkerchief hanging limp and stained gray in his grip. He looked up and down the corridor, empty, just the rows of dark doors and the occasional shift of shadow where a prisoner moved in their sleep. He realized then with a clarity that made his stomach turn over, that the stain was not on the surface at all. It was inside. It was the moral residue of the lie he had just transcribed, the formalized coercion that would hang a man who might be innocent or who might be guilty, but who was certainly broken by a system designed to crush rather than to cure. He had dipped his quill in justice, he told himself when he took the job, but the well was filled with something else entirely. Something that stained the soul just as surely as this pigment stained the skin. A door slammed further down the hall. A guard shouted something unintelligible, the words bouncing off the bricks and dying before they reached Harrow. He tucked the soiled handkerchief back into his pocket, hiding the evidence of his futile scrubbing. He could not stand here all night, picking at his own skin while Williams sat in the dark, waiting for a dawn that might not bring mercy. He turned back towards the cell. The walk back felt longer. The distance he had covered in 30 strides now seemed to stretch into miles, the flagstones rising to meet his boots with increased resistance. The air grew heavier, the smell of lime and waste intensifying until it tasted like ash in his mouth. Each step required a conscious effort, a deliberate lifting of the leg, as if the ink in his veins had turned to lead, anchoring him to the spot, demanding he stay rooted in the corridor rather than return to the scene of the crime he had just documented. Complicity, the word sat on his tongue, bitter and unswallowable. He reached the door, the guard was gone, the slot closed. Harrow knocked again, softer this time. The bolt slid back. He stepped inside. The cell was exactly as he had left it, yet entirely changed. The candle had been relit, perhaps by a draught, perhaps by some trick of the air pressure, but the flame was low, struggling against the gloom, casting shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the walls and prowl the floor. Williams sat on the straw pallet. He had not moved. His posture was identical to the moment Harrow had fled. Head bowed, hands resting on his knees, the coarse fabric of his waistcoat pulled tight across his shoulders. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of shock, of a mind reeling under the impact of a blow. It was the silence of a decision made. The air in the room hummed with a terrible, static tension, like the moment before a thunderclap, when the sky holds its breath and the birds cease their singing. Harrow sat at the table. The ledger lay open, the wet ink of his last entry glistening under the flickering light. He picked up his quill. The feather felt greasy in his fingers, contaminated. He looked at his hands again. In this dimmer light, the stains seemed to have spread further, creeping up his wrists, vanishing under the cuffs of his shirt. He pulled the sleeves down, hiding them from view, though he knew the covering was an illusion. "Mr. Williams," Harrow said. His voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor in his hands. "The magistrate will return at first light." Williams did not answer. He did not even shift his weight. He simply stared at the wall, his eyes fixed on a point in the darkness that Harrow could not see. "We must complete the inventory of your effects," Harrow continued, the words feeling like stones dropping into a deep well. "For the coroner, in the event." He trailed off. The sentence hung unfinished, unnecessary. They both knew what came next. The inventory was a formality, a bureaucratic shuffle performed while the body was still warm, preparing the paperwork for a corpse that had not yet ceased to breathe. Williams slowly lifted his head. He looked at Harrow, and the expression on his face was not one of anger or fear or even sadness. It was a look of profound exhaustion, the kind that comes after a long voyage where the ship has been battered by storms and the crew lost, leaving only the captain to steer the wreck into the harbor. "You need not write it down, Mr. Harrow," Williams said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence with the precision of a razor. "The ink is dry enough." Harrow froze. The quill hovered above the paper, a drop of black fluid gathering at the nib, swelling, trembling, ready to fall. "It is procedure," Harrow managed, the defense sounding weak, hollow. "Procedure," Williams repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth, as if it were a foreign language he had once known but forgotten. "Yes, that is what you call it." He looked down at his own hands. They were clean, unstained. He flexed his fingers, watching the tendons move beneath the skin, then clenched them into fists. "I am tired, Mr. Harrow," he said softly, "so very tired." He reached up and touched the seam of his waistcoat again, his fingers tracing the rough thread with a strange, rhythmic tenderness. Harrow watched him, the drop of ink finally detaching from the nib and falling onto the page. It hit the paper with a silent splash, blooming outward, a perfect dark circle that swallowed the white space beneath it. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say something, anything, that might break the spell, that might pull the man back from the precipice he was so clearly approaching. But the words would not come. They were stuck in his throat, choked by the same ink that stained his hands. He sat motionless, watching the sailor's fingers work at the fabric, listening to the ragged sound of his own breathing, waiting for the next sound that would change everything. The candle flame dipped, shuddered, and then, with a final, despairing hiss, went out. Darkness flooded the cell, absolute and suffocating. In the blackness, Harrow heard the sharp, tearing sound of fabric ripping. Darkness held the room, thick and suffocating, a physical weight pressing against the eyes until shape ceased to exist and only the memory of light remained. Harrow sat frozen, the quill still pinched between thumb and forefinger, useless now that the candle had surrendered its ghost. He waited for a cry, a struggle, the frantic clatter of a body hitting the floor, but the silence stretched, taut as a bowstring pulled to the breaking point. Then came the sound, not a scream. A wet, choking rattle, like a dog trying to swallow a bone too large for its throat, followed by the soft, definitive thud of weight collapsing onto straw. Harrow moved before thought could intervene. He struck flint against steel, the sparks dancing brief and futile in the void until the tinder caught, a tiny orange eye opening in the gloom. He lifted the taper to the candle's stub. Wax hissed. Flame bloomed, casting long, jerking shadows that seemed to recoil from the corner where Williams lay. The sailor was no longer on the pallet. He had slid to the floor, curled tight against the iron leg of the bed frame. A strip of coarse linen, torn from the hem of his own shirt, was knotted around his neck, pulled so taut the fabric bit deep into the flesh, turning the skin above the ligature an angry, mottled purple. The other end of the strip was tied to the bedpost, a simple knot, efficient and final. Williams's face was turned upward, eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling cracks, the tongue swelling slightly against the teeth, dark and swollen as a bruised plum. There was no drama in the posture, no theatrical flailing, just a man who had decided the weight of the world was too heavy to carry any longer and had found a way to set it down. Harrow stood over him. He expected the surge of horror, the gut-twisting shock that proper men were supposed to feel when witnessing death, especially a death so violent and self-inflicted. Instead, a cold, hollow relief washed through him, clean and sharp as winter air. The tension that had coiled in his belly for days, the endless scratching of the quill, the paranoid glances from Colquhoun, the roaring mob outside the Walser, it all snapped. Broken, finished. "Guard," Harrow called out. His voice did not tremble. It sounded flat, stripped of emotion, echoing off the damp stone walls. "Guard, attend me." Boots clattered in the corridor outside, heavy and hurried. The lock turned with a grinding screech of rusted iron, and the door swung open, admitting a sliver of grey morning light from the hallway and the bulk of turnkey Miller. Miller stopped on the threshold, his lantern swinging, the light catching the stillness of the scene. He looked at the body, then at Harrow, his face draining of color until he looked like parchment stretched over skull. "Jesus save us," Miller whispered, crossing himself with a hand that shook. He's gone." "He is dead, Mr. Miller," Harrow corrected, stepping around the corpse with careful precision, avoiding the pool of shadow beneath the neck. "Do not contaminate the scene. Fetch the magistrate, immediately." Miller nodded, mouth working but no sound coming out, before turning and stumbling back into the corridor, his boots slipping on the wet stones. Harrow closed the door, shutting the smell of stale sweat and sudden excrement back inside with the dead man. He returned to the small table where the ledger lay open, the page waiting, blank and accusatory. He sat, picked up the quill. The feather felt slick, greasy, as if the oil from his skin had seeped into the shaft during the night. He dipped the nib into the inkwell. The black fluid swallowed the metal point, cold and viscous. He touched the nib to the paper. December 1811, Coldbath Fields Prison, Cell 4. The words formed themselves, neat, round, impersonal. His hand moved with a mechanical rhythm, independent of his will, the scratches of the nib sounding like rats gnawing at the wood of the table. He described the position of the body, supine, head angled northwest, feet drawn up. He noted the ligature, strip of linen approximately 2 inches wide, knotted twice at the posterior of the neck, secured to the bed frame iron. He recorded the time, approximating the hour of 6, based on the fading of the candle and the grey quality of the light filtering through the high, barred window. He did not write about the look in Williams's eyes, the terrible exhaustion that had seemed to leach the very marrow from his bones before he died. He did not write about the silence that had followed the tearing of the shirt, a silence so complete it felt like a physical blow. He wrote only what could be measured, weighed, and filed. The ink flowed smoothly, a dark river carving a path through the white expanse of the page, covering the truth with a layer of official fiction. Each word was a brick, building a wall between the man who had died and the crime he was supposed to have committed. Harrow paused, the quill hovering. A single drop of ink gathered at the tip, swollen and heavy, threatening to fall and ruin the neat column of dates. He watched it, mesmerized by its perfection, the way it held together against gravity, a tiny sphere of absolute black. He thought of the Marr family, their blood spilled across the parlor floor, inkless and chaotic. He thought of Williams, a sailor who could barely sign his name, now immortalized in this ledger as a monster who had taken his own life rather than face the gallows. The drop fell, it hit the paper just below the date, blooming outward, a dark stain that looked disturbingly like a bruise. Harrow did not blot it. He let it sit there, a flaw in the perfection, a testament to the messiness of real death that no amount of bureaucratic precision could fully erase. Footsteps approached in the corridor, sharper, more authoritative than Miller's frantic scramble. Colquhoun. Harrow capped the inkwell and folded his hands on the table, waiting. The door opened again, and the magistrate stepped inside, his coat brushed clean, his wig perfectly powdered, carrying the crisp scent of expensive soap and winter air that seemed alien in the stench of the cell. Colquhoun looked at the body, his expression unreadable, a mask of professional detachment that fooled no one who knew the pressure of the last fortnight. "Well," Colquhoun said, his voice low, devoid of surprise, "he has saved us the trouble, then." "He has, sir," Harrow replied. He pushed the ledger forward, the fresh ink still glistening under the lantern light. "The entry is made, pending your verification." Colquhoun stepped closer, his shadow falling over the page, obscuring the words. He looked down at the dead man, then at Harrow, his eyes hard and bright. "See that the coroner is swift. The city waits for nothing, Mr. Harrow, not even the dead." Harrow nodded, but his gaze drifted back to the ink stain on the page, the dark bloom spreading slowly into the fibers of the paper, swallowing the white space just as the fog swallowed the streets outside. The relief he had felt moments ago was already curdling, turning into something heavier, something that would sit in his stomach long after the body was cut down and the mob had gone home. He reached for the quill again, ready to write the next lie, because the story was not over. It was only just beginning. Colquhoun crouched. The fine wool of his coat brushed the damp straw scattered near the corpse, gathering specks of filth that would require a vigorous brushing later, though the magistrate showed no concern for such trivialities now. His hand hovered over the dead sailor's chest, fingers stiff with cold, before plucking a folded square of paper from the slack grip of the right hand. The movement was surgical, devoid of reverence, treating the body as merely another piece of furniture in the room that had ceased to function. He stood, unfolding the sheet with a sharp crack of paper that echoed off the stone walls, louder than any word spoken since the discovery. "Read it," Colquhoun commanded. Harrow leaned forward. The lantern light flickered across the page, illuminating lines of script that marched with military precision across the grain. "I am guilty. I cannot bear the weight. God forgive me." The loops were elegant, the crossing of the T's deliberate and firm. Harrow knew the rough scrawl Williams had used on the intake forms 3 weeks prior, a shaky, childlike effort where letters stumbled over one another like drunkards in a gutter. This was the hand of a clerk or a schoolmaster, not a man who had spent 30 years hauling lines on a collier. "This hand is too steady," Harrow said. The words tasted like ash. "Desperation lends strength to the weakest arm," Colquhoun replied. He smoothed the paper against the table, flattening a crease near the margin with a thumb that pressed hard enough to whiten the nail. He knew the end was coming. He wished to make it clear. Williams could barely sign his name. He signed this. Colquhoun tapped the bottom of the page where a signature sprawled, bold and black, and you will verify it. The air in the cell felt thick, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Harrow looked from the paper to the face of the dead man. Williams's eyes were half open, clouded with a milky film that reflected the candle flame in two dull yellow points. There was no accusation in that gaze, only a vacant release, as if the sailor had finally understood that his voice mattered less than the story others needed to tell. Harrow's fingers tightened around the quill. The feather shaft felt brittle, ready to snap under the pressure of his grip. To refuse would be to invite chaos. The mob outside the walls already bayed for blood, a single organism driven by hunger and fear that would tear the prison apart if denied its sacrifice. Colquhoun stood between that fury and the rule of law, a dam holding back a flood of violence with nothing but paperwork and procedure. If Harrow cracked the seal now, questioned the authenticity of the note, the dam would break. The truth would spill out, messy and uncontainable, and drown them all in the ensuing riot. He dipped the nib. The inkwell sat near the edge of the ledger, a small pool of darkness waiting to be deployed. He touched the metal to the paper where the verification line waited blank. The quill scratched, a dry, rasping sound that filled the silence between the two living men. Harrow wrote attested, the letters forming automatically muscle memory overriding the screaming protest of his conscience. He dated it. He signed his own name, Timothy Harrow, clerk of Bow Street, binding himself to the lie with every loop of the H. Done, Harrow whispered. Colquhoun nodded, a single sharp dip of the chin. He reached out and took the paper, folding it neatly before tucking it into the inner pocket of his coat, close to the heart. The gesture was possessive, final. The evidence was no longer part of the scene. It belonged to the office now, to be filed away where no curious eyes might question the slope of the G or the pressure of the pen. See to the coroner, Colquhoun said, turning towards the door. Tell him to be quick. The streets are growing restless. He paused with his hand on the latch, looking back over his shoulder. The shadow from his tricorn hat obscured his eyes, leaving only the sharp line of his jaw visible in the gloom. You have served the city well, Mr. Harrow. Do not forget that when the histories are written. The door closed, the lock clicked. Harrow was alone with the dead man again. He sat still for a long moment, listening to the retreating footsteps fade down the corridor. The cell felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as if the brickwork itself sought to compress the space until there was no room left for breath. He looked down at the ledger. The fresh ink on the verification line glistened, wet and vulnerable, before slowly sinking into the fiber of the page. It changed color as it dried, shifting from a glossy black to a matte, permanent gray, a stain that would not wash out. A mark that would remain long after the flesh had rotted from Williams's bones. Harrow capped the inkwell. The lid fit with a soft pop, sealing the fluid away from the air. He wiped the nib on a rag, watching the black smear spread across the linen like a bruise forming on skin. He folded the rag and placed it beside the ledger, unable to look at it directly. The smell of the cell had changed. The stale sweat and excrement was still there, but now there was something else, a metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat, the scent of a transaction completed in the dark. He stood up, his knees cracked, the sound loud in the quiet room. He walked to the small barred window set high in the wall, standing on tiptoe to peer through the grime-streaked glass. Below, the prison yard was filling with shadows. Men gathered at the gates, their faces upturned towards the building, mouths open in shouts that did not reach the cell but vibrated through the stone floor anyway. They waved hats and sticks, a sea of dark shapes surging against the wooden barriers. Harrow pressed his forehead against the cold pane. The glass bit into his skin, a sharp reminder of the barrier between him and them. He was inside, safe with the dead and the lies. They were outside, hungry for a conclusion that would allow them to sleep tonight without checking the locks on their doors. He watched a stone strike the gate, bouncing off the wood with a dull thud that signaled the beginning of the siege. The verification was dry. The lie was solid. Now the city would come to collect its prize. The stone struck wood again. A dull, wet thud that traveled up through the flagstones and settled in the soles of Harrow's boots. Below, the courtyard heaved. It was not a gathering of individuals, but a single, breathing beast, a mass of wool coats and bare heads pressing against the timber gates until the heavy beams groaned in protest. They wanted the body, not for burial, not for the solemn rites of the church that might offer a sliver of mercy to a departed soul, but for the street. They demanded the spectacle of the knife through the heart, the dragging of limbs over cobbles, the public dismemberment that would exorcise their terror and leave them clean. Harrow watched a hat fly into the air, tossed by a hand reaching too high, only to be trampled instantly into the mud churned by hundreds of frantic feet. "Break it down!" The shout rose above the general roar, a jagged spike of sound that pierced the thick masonry. It came from a man in a leather apron, his face flushed a deep, angry crimson, shaking a fist at the guardhouse window where Harrow stood. The man's mouth worked around the words, spitting them with a fervor that made the glass vibrate against Harrow's forehead. "They've killed him, let us have the carcass." Another voice joined, then 10, then 100, merging into a low, guttural chant that sounded less like human speech and more like the grinding of millstones. "Blood for blood. The sailor pays. The sailor pays." The rhythm was hypnotic, a drumbeat of vengeance that drowned out the distant tolling of the church bells, those measured, polite strokes of time that seemed absurdly out of place against the raw hunger of the mob. Harrow stepped back from the window, the cold residue of the glass lingering on his skin like a fever sweat. He could not watch them tear the dead man apart. To witness that final indignity would be to admit that the law had failed entirely, that the signature he had just pressed onto the page was nothing more than a permission slip for butchery. He turned his back on the light. The cell plunged into a deeper gloom, the shadows stretching out from the corners to reclaim the space where Williams lay. The body looked smaller now, curled slightly as if seeking warmth in the damp straw, the ligature around the neck, a dark, ugly ridge against the pale flesh. Harrow moved to the table, his movements stiff, as if his joints had filled with sand. He picked up the ledger. The leather cover felt slick under his palm, damp with the humidity of the room and the oil of his own nervous grip. It was heavy, hefted in one hand, the book dragged at his wrist, a physical manifestation of the lie contained within its pages. Every sheet represented a choice made, a truth suppressed, a life reduced to ink and procedure. He opened it to the final page of the Ratcliffe entry, the fresh signature of Timothy Harrow still gleaming wetly beside the attestation of the suicide note. The ink had not yet fully surrendered to the paper. It sat on the surface, vulnerable, waiting to be smudged or scraped away, though he knew no one would dare attempt such a thing now. The weight of it pressed down on the table, threatening to crack the wood. A wave of nausea rolled through him, starting in the gut and rising fast to choke the throat. He swallowed hard, forcing it back, but the taste of bile lingered, sharp and acidic, mixing with the stale air of the cell. He needed to be away from this room, from the smell of the dead sailor and the phantom scent of the forgery, yet his feet refused to carry him towards the door. The lock clicked in his memory, the sound of Colquhoun's departure sealing him in with the consequences of his compliance. He was a clerk, a man of records. His duty was to document, to preserve, to file. But what was there to preserve here? Only a fabrication, a story constructed to soothe a frightened city while the real killer walked free, perhaps even watching the mob from the safety of a tavern, laughing at the ease with which justice could be bought with a drop of ink. "So?" The guard's voice came from the other side of the door, muffled by the thick oak, but distinct enough to make Harrow flinch. The key turned in the lock, a harsh metallic grind that signaled the end of his solitude. "Sir, the governor says the gates won't hold much longer. They're bringing up a beam." Harrow stared at the ledger. The words swam before his eyes, the neat columns of dates and names blurring into a grey smear. He could not leave the book here. If the mob breached the cell, they would destroy everything, scattering the pages like chaff, tearing the truth into confetti to be swept into the gutter. He had to take it. He had to carry the weight of this sin out into the street, past the screaming faces, and lock it away in the archive where it would fester in the dark, alongside 100 other failures of the law. "Tell them to hold," Harrow said, his voice sounding thin, stripped of authority. "Tell them the magistrate is preparing the body for release." It was a lie, another one. Colquhoun was gone, likely already seated in a carriage bound for the safety of his home, leaving Harrow to manage the fallout. But the guard did not know that. The guard needed an order, a piece of paper authority to shout back at the wolves. "They want the corpse now, sir. They're saying we are hiding him." "They are not hiding him," Harrow snapped, the sudden anger surprising even himself. He grabbed the ledger, shoving it into his satchel with a roughness that crumpled the corner of the page. "They are waiting for the coroner. Go, keep the gate shut." The guard hesitated, the silence stretching taut between them, filled only by the rising clamor from the yard. Then the footsteps retreated, hurried and scuffing, leaving Harrow alone once more with the dead man and the bag heavy against his hip. He took a breath, filling his lungs with the foul air, and stepped towards the door. His hand hovered over the latch. Beyond lay the corridor, the stairwell, and finally the archway that opened onto the prison yard. He would have to walk through them. He would have to pass within arm's reach of the men who wanted to hack the body to pieces, men who believed they were serving justice while committing a barbarism that would stain the city's soul for generations. He thought of the cobblestones out there, slick with rain and mud, soon to be slick with something darker. Harrow tightened his grip on the satchel strap. The leather bit into his shoulder, a sharp, grounding pain. He pushed the door open. The noise rushed in to meet him, a physical wall of sound that nearly knocked him backward. The chant had grown louder, more frenzied, a single word repeating over and over until it lost all meaning. Williams, Williams, Williams. It was no longer a name. It was a curse, a spell cast to bind the spirit of the dead man to the earth so they could destroy it utterly. He stepped into the corridor, the door clicking shut behind him, severing the quiet of the cell from the chaos of the world. The walk to the archive would be short, but it felt like a march to the gallows. He adjusted his coat, hiding the bulge of the ledger against his ribs, and began to move, one foot in front of the other, towards the gates that were already splintering under the weight of the crowd's desire. The beam struck the gate with a wet thud, wood groaning against iron hinges, in a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of Harrow's own pulse. "Back, get back!" The guard's shout fractured, swallowed instantly by the roar of the crowd pressing against the Coldbath Field's archway. Harrow kept his head down, chin tucked into the wool of his coat, shielding the satchel strapped tight across his chest. The leather dug into his collarbone, a sharp, unyielding pressure that grounded him as the world tilted towards madness. He moved not with the stride of a clerk on official business, but with the shuffling gait of a man trying to make himself small, invisible, anything other than the target of 300 voices screaming for blood that had already ceased to flow. Mud sucked at his boots. The yard was a churned mess of slush and coal dust, the ground pitted where the mob had stamped their feet in anticipation of the spectacle they had been denied inside the cell. Rain fell in a fine, freezing mist that clung to eyelashes and turned the brim of his hat into a soggy weight, blurring the edges of the torches sputtering in the hands of the front rank. Smoke curled thick and acrid, stinging the eyes, carrying the scent of wet dog and unwashed bodies, a smell so primal it bypassed the nose and settled directly in the throat, choking him. "There he is, that's the clerk." A finger, thick and dirt-caked, jabbed towards Harrow's shoulder. The accusation rippled through the front line, a physical wave of attention that made the skin on his arms prickle. He kept his gaze pinned to the mud at his boots. To meet their eyes would be to acknowledge the accusation, to invite the judgment that he was part of the machinery that had robbed them of their vengeance. Instead, he focused on the gap between two men, a narrow sliver of darkness beyond the gate where the street waited, grey and indifferent. "Hold the line," the governor's voice cracked like a whip, though it lacked the authority to command the sea of humanity surging against the bars. "The body is not for display. Stand fast." "It's a lie," a woman shrieked, her voice raw, tearing through the din with the precision of a razor. "They're letting him rot in peace while our boys bleed in the gutters. Give us the corpse." The beam hammered again. This time the iron shrieked, a high-pitched protest of metal under stress that sent a jolt of nausea through Harrow's stomach. He tightened his grip on the satchel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. Inside, the ledger sat heavy and silent, a brick of paper and ink that contained more lies than truth. It was the only thing that mattered now. If the mob broke through, They would tear the pages to shreds, scattering the official record of John Williams's death to the wind along with the scraps of his coat. They would not care about the forgery of the suicide note, nor the convenient timing of the discovery, nor the way Colquhoun had swept the real questions under the rug like dust. They wanted flesh. They wanted the ritual of destruction. "Make way," Harrow shouted, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, brittle and unconvincing. "Clear for the watch. Make way for the magistrate's business." No one moved. The wall of bodies remained solid, heaving slightly as the pressure from behind pushed the front rank harder against the gate. A man next to him, face smeared with soot, leaned in close enough that Harrow could smell the gin on his breath, sour and hot. "Magistrate's gone," the man muttered, eyes wild, fixed on the cell door behind Harrow rather than the clerk himself. "Saw his carriage leave 10 minutes ago. Left you to clean the mess, didn't he? Typical." "He has entrusted the body to my care," Harrow said, forcing his voice to remain steady, though his legs trembled beneath him. "Step aside." "Entrusted," the man laughed, a harsh, barking sound that held no humor. "He entrusted you to bury the truth, more like. We know what happened in there, clerk. We know he didn't hang himself. Not with those hands, not with that fear in his eyes." The crowd surged forward. The gate buckled another inch. Iron groaned against stone, and a shower of rust flaked down onto Harrow's shoulders, staining his coat the color of dried blood. He stumbled back, heel catching on a loose cobble, and for a terrifying second he thought he would fall, that the satchel would slip from his grasp and be trampled into the mud. He threw out a hand, grabbing the rough brick of the wall to steady himself, the grit scraping his palm. "Let us have him," the chant rose again, unified, deafening. "Williams, Williams, give us Williams." Harrow scrambled upright, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could not stay here. The gate would not hold another minute, perhaps not another 30 seconds. If they broke in, they would kill him too, or at least batter him senseless in their frenzy to get to the dead man. He had to move. He had to get the ledger out of the prison, into the safety of the archives where the dust and the darkness could swallow it whole, where it would sit on a shelf and poison the history of the case from the inside out. He turned sharply, abandoning the pretense of walking through the crowd. There was a side door, a narrow servant's entrance used for delivering coal and removing waste, located down the narrow alley to the left of the main arch. It was locked usually, but the key might still be in the lock, or the latch might be slipped if the guard had been called away to reinforce the gate. It was a risk, a desperate one, but staying here was a death sentence. "Hey, where's he going?" The shout came from his left. A boy, no older than 12, pointed a grimy finger as Harrow broke into a run, splashing through a puddle that soaked the hem of his trousers with icy water. The crowd's attention shifted, a hydra turning its many heads towards the new movement. The roar changed pitch, becoming a growl of pursuit. "Stop him! Don't let him take the book!" Harrow did not look back. He pounded down the alley, the satchel bouncing against his hip with every stride, the leather strap chafing his neck raw. The walls closed in, brick pressing close on either side, slick with moss and runoff. At the end, the wooden door stood dark and unyielding. He reached it, fumbling with the iron latch, his fingers numb and clumsy. It was stuck. Rust and paint had fused the mechanism solid. Behind him, footsteps splashed in the puddles, closing the distance. Heavy breathing, the scrape of boots on stone. "Got you!" Harrow threw his shoulder against the wood. Once, twice. On the third impact, the latch gave with a splintering crack, and the door swung inward, revealing the dark mouth of the coal chute beyond. He threw himself through the gap, stumbling into the gloom, and slammed the door shut just as a hand slapped against the wood from the other side. "Bastard," the voice was muffled, furious. "Open up." Harrow leaned his weight against the door, listening to the fists pounding on the other side, the shouts of frustration that faded slightly as the distance grew. He was in. He was inside the service tunnels, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetables, safe for the moment. But the ledger burned against his chest, a hot coal of guilt that no amount of running could extinguish. He had escaped the mob, but he had not escaped the crime. He adjusted the strap, took a breath that tasted of mildew, and began to walk into the dark, towards the river, towards the archive. towards the silence he would have to keep for the rest of his life. Darkness swallowed him whole, not the polite gloom of a curtained room, but a thick, physical weight that pressed against the eyeballs. Coal dust hung in the air, dry and choking, coating the back of the throat with every gasp. Harrow moved forward, one hand trailing along the damp brickwork to keep his line. The mortar felt slick as eel's skin, cold enough to leach the warmth from his fingertips. Behind him, the thudding on the service door had ceased, replaced by the distant, muffled roar of the mob still battering the main gates. They wanted blood. They wanted a spectacle. He carried neither, only a book bound in calf leather that felt heavier than a corpse. His left hand tightened on the satchel strap. The leather bit into his palm. He shifted the weight, trying to ease the strain on his shoulder, but the bag swung awkwardly, knocking against his thigh with a dull thud. Inside, the ledger shifted. Papers rustled, a dry, whispering sound like dead leaves skittering over a grave. He stopped, listened. The tunnel branched ahead, a black mouth splitting into two paths. One sloped downward, smelling of stagnant water and rot. The other remained level, carrying the fainter scent of wood smoke and street filth. "Who walks there?" The voice erupted from the darkness ahead, sharp and brittle. Harrow flinched, shoulder jerking up towards his ear. A lantern flared into life 10 yards down the level passage, the flame sputtering inside the glass chimney before settling into a steady yellow glow. The light carved a man out of the shadows. Turnkey's uniform, grey wool stained at the cuffs. A heavy ring of keys hung from his belt, iron against iron clicking softly as he breathed. "Bow Street office," Harrow said. The words tasted like ash. "Magistrate's business." The turnkey did not lower the lantern. He held it high, squinting against the glare reflecting off the wet bricks. "Magistrate's gone. Carriage left 5 minutes past. Saw it myself from the grate. Colonel Colquhoun entrusted me with the records." Harrow stepped into the circle of light. He kept his left hand pressed flat against the satchel, hiding the bulge of the ledger. "Open the gate to Fleet Lane." "Records." The turnkey lowered the lantern slightly, the light catching the deep lines around his mouth. He spat on the ground. A dark globule landed near Harrow's boot. "Records don't make the mob scream like that. Bodies make them scream, or blood." "The records contain the account of the body." Harrow pushed past him, brushing the turnkey's shoulder. The wool felt damp. "Do your duty, man. Open the gate." "Duty." The turnkey turned, following him. The keys jangled again, a rhythmic accompaniment to their steps. "Duty's a fine word for digging holes. You got ink on your hand, clerk." Harrow froze. He looked down. His right hand, the one that had gripped the quill not an hour ago, was stained. A smear of black ran across the knuckles, dried now into a crusty ridge. It looked like a bruise, like the bloom of ink on the first page of the Marr deposition. He curled his fingers into a fist, hiding the stain against his palm. "Writing," Harrow said. "It's what clerks do." "Writing lies, more like." The turnkey stopped at a heavy iron gate barred across the tunnel. He selected a key from the ring, the metal scraping against the others. "Williams didn't hang himself. Everyone knows it. Even the rats in the walls know it." The key grated in the lock. Tumblers clicked. Harrow said nothing. He watched the turnkey's hands, rough and red-knuckled, working the mechanism. The man was right. The lie sat in the bag against Harrow's hip, heavy and undeniable. To speak would be to undo the peace Colquhoun had bought with a dead sailor's reputation. To speak would be to invite the mob back into the cells. To speak would be to drown. "Open it," Harrow said. His voice lacked the command he intended. It sounded thin, stretched tight over a hollow core. The gate swung inward. Beyond lay the street. Fog rolled across the cobbles, thick and yellow, lit by the distant glow of oil lamps struggling against the night. The air here smelled of river mud, of tide going out, dragging the city's filth back to the sea. Harrow stepped through. The turnkey did not follow. He remained in the shadow of the archway, lantern held low. "You'll carry that stain," the turnkey called out. "Ink doesn't wash off easy, not the kind used for death warrants." Harrow did not turn back. He walked into the fog. The cold hit him instantly, biting through his coat, settling deep in the bone. He kept walking, head down, satchel clutched tight. The streets were empty here, the residents barricaded behind shutters, eyes peering through cracks in the wood. They watched him pass. He could feel their gaze, heavy and suspicious. He was part of the machine now. the machine that chewed men to bone and called it justice. He turned left towards Holborn. The archive waited, a stone vault where the truth went to die slowly, surrounded by damp and rats. His feet dragged. Every step felt like wading through the river itself, the mud sucking at his boots. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the flint of his own tinderbox. He could burn it, here, in the gutter. Let the pages curl and blacken, let the smoke rise and join the fog. Let the truth vanish like breath in winter. He stopped. A cart rumbled past, wheels iron-shod, sparking against the stones. The driver looked at him, face obscured by a scarf, eyes bright in the gloom. Harrow pulled his hand from his pocket. He gripped the satchel strap instead. Burning it changed nothing. The lie was already spoken, the mob already satisfied, the ink already dry. Going to the office, the driver pulled the reins. The horse snorted, steam billowing from its nostrils. Passing through, Harrow said. He moved around the cart, keeping to the edge of the pavement where the mud was thickest. Best hurry, the driver muttered, flicking the whip. Curfew's near, don't want to be caught out with the watch in this mood. Harrow nodded, though the man couldn't see it. He walked faster. The rhythm of his boots on the stone became a mantra. Lie, lie, lie. The sound of the tide rose again, distant but persistent, washing against the stairs down by Blackfriars. It didn't care about ledgers. It didn't care about Williams or Marr or Colquhoun. It would rise and fall until the stones wore away. He reached the corner of Chancery Lane. The archive building loomed ahead, a block of shadow against the slightly lighter sky. A single candle burned in the upper window, Colquhoun's clerk, waiting. Harrow climbed the steps. His hand hovered over the knocker. He could leave the bag here, walk away, disappear into the fog like a ghost. He looked at his stained hand again. The black ridge on his knuckle caught the light from the window. It looked permanent. It looked like part of the skin. He knocked 3 sharp raps. The sound echoed down the street, final as a gunshot. Inside, footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. The lock turned. Harrow stepped into the light, carrying the darkness with him. The Shoreditch Silence is not a documentary record. It is a work of historical fiction, grounded in the real case and historical record of Ratcliffe Highway murders. Its central figures and events are real, and the dates, places and outcomes are faithful to the record. The dialogue, the private scenes and the interiors are imagined, dramatized, not documented. Where the story departs from the verifiable facts, the liberty is the author's own. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Old stories retold, Internet Archive. A very British murder, the story of a national obsession, Internet Archive. Ratcliffe Highway murders. The Highway, London. Primary material researched via the Internet Archive. Context via Wikipedia.